Testing 1 2 3. Testing 1 2 3. Alright, I'm assuming that's good. Let's see, how are things going? Where was I? Right, I was going to tell somebody that live streaming. Do 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 do. Aren't we on 5?
Sector 13. Of all the worlds I've visited in my long and discreditable career, I suppose Kefir stands out as one of the most pleasant. In the abstract, at least, we were there to fight a war, don't forget, so there was plenty to keep the mind occupied. But in the main, I look back on my years there through a faint haze of nostalgia. Being an agri-world, the landscape was almost completely rural, so my overriding impression was one of endless plains of lush greenery cut across by isolated roads, which occasionally intersected at quaint rustic villages where nothing much seemed to have changed since the Emperor was in short track. Mountain ranges, while the narrow equatorial band was mercifully free of any landmass worth fighting over. There were a few small island chains where tiny inbred communities fished and grew tropical fruit, but they were too insignificant to have attracted any enemy attention and were ignored by our side too after the initial sweeps. All in all, I was pretty pleased with life. My inadvertent heroism on Desolatia a couple of years before had won me a little notoriety among the Imperial Task Force, and I'd been able to capitalize on that quite nicely. Even after all this time, there were still sufficient senior officers and administratum functionaries wanting to shake my hand to keep me comfortably occupied, attending receptions and seminars far from the fighting, so that I frequently found myself away from my unit for days on end. A deprivation that Colonel Mostru, our commanding officer, bore with commendable fortitude, I have to say. Even while I was at my post, things were hardly onerous. The 12th Valhallan Field Artillery were parked well behind the lines, as you'd expect, so I'd had little occasion to face the enemy directly. Indeed, since we were engaged in a protracted campaign to cleanse the planet of a gene-stealer infestation, there was seldom anything to fire our guns at in any case. The war was a subtle one for the most part. A counterinsurgency and surgical strikes, with the enemy seldom massing in numbers sufficient to justify an artillery barrage. The occasional exceptions to this were renegade units of the local planetary defense force, which would turn out to be riddled with Steeler cultists with depressing regularity, and turn their guns on the guard or the local units sent to deal with them until our overwhelming superiority in numbers and firepower had their inevitable effect.
That's good.
Like most agri-worlds, Kefir was sparsely populated by Imperial standards. This made our job of cleansing the place both easier and harder than it might have been. Easier, in that cities were few and far between. I think there were no more than a dozen on the entire globe, which meant that the dense concentrations of population steel occult needs to really take root and hide in were absent, but harder, in that the cult had instead become attenuated, spreading its tentacles widely in small pockets of infestation rather than remaining sufficiently concentrated to root out and destroy in a single strike. The upshot of all this was that we'd been forced into a protracted campaign, cleansing the world province by province, one brood at a time, and we'd already seen 3 winters come and go since we'd arrived here. Some, of course, found the slow pace of the campaign frustrating. Not least my crony and closest friend in the battery, Lieutenant Divas, who, as always, was chafing at the bit, eager to get the matter over with and move on to the next war. "We're making progress," I told him, uncorking the bottle of well-matured Amasec, which had somehow found its way into my kit bag after the last round of handshaking and finger food I'd been dragged off to. "Both the northern continents are completely clean already." "But they were only ever lightly infested to begin with," he rejoined, finding a couple of tea bowls in the clutter on my desk, which Jurgen, my aide, had failed to tidy up before disappearing on some mysterious errand of his own. "The majority of the Steelers were always down south of here. You know that." "Your point being?" I asked, pouring the amber liquid with care. Divas shrugged, looking uncannily like a bored child getting tired of the current amusement. "I don't know. We could be here for years yet if something doesn't change." "I suppose we could," I agreed, trying not to sound too pleased at the prospect. That would have suited me fine. My adventures with the Tyranids on Desolatia striking me as more than enough excitement for one commissarial career. Had I but known, of course, it had just been the prelude to a lifetime of narrow escapes from almost certain death. But back then, I had yet to develop the innate paranoia which was to serve me so well in my subsequent century of running for cover and shooting back when I couldn't avoid it. The prolonged period of relative quiet had lulled me into a false sense of security, which a few years later would have elicited nothing more than a vague sense of waiting for the other boot to drop. So as I poured the drinks, I had little inkling of the fact that the turning point of the entire campaign was no more than a few hours away, and that once again I would find myself caught up in the middle of events over which I had not the slightest control. The irony was that I'd had my chance to avoid it, but at the time I thought I was being remarkably prudent in not doing so. You see, Colonel Mostru had never quite shaken the feeling that I'd been less than honest about my supposed heroism on Desolatia, when my attempt to save my own neck had inadvertently stumbled across a swarm of Nids which would otherwise have annihilated us, and my subsequent panic dash back to our own lines had drawn them neatly into the killing zone of our guns. He'd never said anything directly about it, of course, but after that, he made a point of creating subtle opportunities for me to prove my mettle, which generally amounted to nudging me in the general direction of trouble and looking out for any overt sign of reluctance to put myself in harm's way again. Luckily, my side trips away from the battery had limited his opportunities for such amusements, but on a couple of occasions, I'd been left with no alternative but to tag along with a forward observer unit with every outward show of enthusiasm, so as not to undermine my fraudulent reputation. As it turned out, these little expeditions hadn't been nearly as unpleasant as I'd anticipated. On each occasion, we'd taken some fire from the cultists as soon as they realized we were sitting out ahead of our own lines, calling in their positions to the battery. But to my well-disguised relief, the subsequent barrages had taken care of that before they got close or accurate enough to be a real nuisance. To all intents and purposes, they'd remained a distant threat, despite the occasional lasbog putting a dent in the sandbags protecting us. Indeed, in all these minor engagements, I'd never even seen the enemy close enough to tell whether they were true hybrids or merely their human dupes. All that was about to change, though, when the Colonel stuck his head into my office the morning after my chat with Divas. "Commissar," he said, nailing me with those ice-blue eyes which always seemed to see a lot further into me than I was comfortable with. "Do you have a moment?" "Of course," I responded, with every sign of politeness, ignoring the faint throbbing of the Amasec hangover I brought into the room with me that morning. "Can I offer you some tea?" "Thank you, no." He moved aside hastily as Jurgen began to pour an extra bowl. I no need refuse, of course, which is why I'd offered. My aide was a splendid fellow in many respects, not the least of which was a singular lack of imagination that he compensated for with a deference to authority and a literal-minded approach to following orders which simplified my own life in many ways. But he was hardly the most prepossessing trooper in the guard, and apart from his habitual untidiness, his spectacular body odor meant that visitors were loath to linger in his general vicinity, certainly not for as long as it would take to drink a bowl of tanner leaf tea, one of the few Valhallan habits I picked up from my prolonged association with the natives of that icebound world, by the way. It's made from a plant that grows in the caverns there, and it has a faintly bitter aftertaste I find most refreshing. As you wish. I sipped at the fragrant liquid and raised an eyebrow in polite inquiry. How can I help you? There's a briefing about the deployment of the garrison troops this afternoon at brigade headquarters, Mostrou said, clearly fighting the impulse to back away from Jurgen. Unlike the ice worlders I'd served with, I had my office and quarters open to the sweet spring breezes, instead of air-conditioned to the temperature of a meat locker. Clearly found the relative warmth mildly uncomfortable, not least because it let my aide's distinctive bouquet flourish. Another good reason for leaving the windows open, of course. I thought you might like to attend, and get palmed off on some risky reconnaissance mission to the battlefront as soon as we were there, no doubt. But I couldn't simply refuse. Inviting me to observe the peacekeeping arrangements for the newly cleansed continents on behalf of the Commissariat was a courtesy, at least on the surface. So I thought I'd better just accept, go along, and hope I could find some excuse to hang back when the danger presented itself. I was just opening my mouth to agree, inwardly cursing the colonel, when Jurgen unexpectedly came to my rescue. Begging your pardon, sir, but if you're going to be leaving the battery, you'd better reply to the Custodes first. The Custodes? Mostrou's eyebrow rose in slightly exaggerated surprise. Have you been up to something I should be concerned about? Quite a bit as it happened, but I wasn't about to tell him that. Instead, I picked up the data slate with the flashing red urgent icon Jurgen had placed on my desk, and which I hadn't been able to face looking at through the hangover until the tanner tea kicked in, and glanced at it briefly. Not this time. I smiled too, so we could both pretend it was a joke, and nodded to Jurgen. Thank you for reminding me. I turned back to the colonel. A few of our gunners are in civilian custody. It seems they got a little over-exuberant in one of the local hostelries last night. I sighed with carefully feigned regret. So, pleasant as this little trip of yours sounds, I suppose I'll have to stay here and sort things out. Of course. He nodded soberly, always a sucker for the duty-first routine, and for once I didn't have to stretch it. Discipline in the battery was definitely my responsibility. So I had the perfect excuse for sidestepping whatever little inconvenience he'd been planning to drop on me. Of course, if I'd known what sorting out that apparently trivial little piece of paperwork would lead to, I'd have gone with him like a shot and taken my chances, but then I'd never have cemented my reputation as a bona fide hero, and the war for Kefir would have taken another turn entirely. The nearest village to our artillery park, Pegas Parva, was about 20 minutes away, or 10 the way Jurgen drove, so I had little time to enjoy the fresh spring air as it wafted in across the kilometers of open fields that lined the road. I'd become quite familiar with the place in the past few months, so I was already well aware that it was somewhat larger than its name implied. It was the bureaucratic center of the region, Sector 13 on the maps of the continent we've been supplied with by the local administratum, so boasted a handful of civic buildings as solid and imposing as the temples and libraries of far larger settlements. In peacetime, it had been home to some 2,000 souls, rather than the handful of hundreds in the surrounding villages, most of them engaged in supporting the scattered farmsteads which clustered around it in some way. But the upheaval of war and the arrival of so many guardsmen in the area with pay packets in need of emptying had almost doubled the population. It goes without saying that most of the new arrivals were supporting the war effort by maintaining morale among the troopers in ways which didn't entirely meet the approval of the long-term residents, or for that matter the local Custodes, which had tripled its manpower over the last few months. That had sounded pretty
Interesting.
impressive, until I'd realized all it meant was that the sector sergeant had been joined by a couple of resentful beat-pounders from the provincial capital, who had clearly been selected on the basis of whoever the authorities there had felt the city was most able to manage perfectly well without. The sergeant herself was another matter entirely, as I knew quite well, having taken care to establish good relations with the local custodies as soon as we were deployed in the region.
I hate
To my
this.
pleasant surprise, this had developed into rather more than a simple working relationship. Winifred Pooh was a solid career officer in her mid-30s, about a decade older than I was at the time, with a full figure which looked quite good in uniform, and even better out of it, as I discovered on a couple of occasions. She was good at her job, knew most of the locals by sight, if not by name and reputation, and had turned down the chance of promotion to more challenging duties in the city at least 3 times that I knew of, because she enjoyed the sense of being part of a close-knit rural community. Despite our friendship, she eyed me coolly as I entered the custodies post from which she exercised her stewardship of the scattered hamlets and villages of Sector 13. "You took your time," she said. I shrugged, smiling cordially for the benefit of her subordinates who were slouching around the place trying to look busy, and advanced through the colonnaded entrance hall of the sector house towards the high wooden counter, which barred the public from the working part of the building. I know, my apologies. I adopted an expression of resigned good humor. They keep us pretty busy in the guard, you know. I can imagine. If the ones we've got downstairs are anything to go by. She prodded the rune, which retracted part of the counter, having recognized her thumbprint, and recoiled slightly as Jurgen followed me through the gap. The nearest constable's jaw dropped visibly as the gap closed behind us with a faint squeak of unoiled runners. "Who's this?" "My aide, Gunner Jurgen." I performed the traditional back-and-forth hand gesture which has accompanied informal introductions since time immemorial. "Jurgen, Sergeant Pooh of the Custodies." "Pleased to meet you, miss." He threw her a sloppy salute, which wasn't strictly necessary, what with her being a custodian and all, but to Jurgen, a sergeant was a sergeant, and that was that. Besides, she appreciated the courtesy and reciprocated with a nod. "Likewise." The pleasantry was reflexive, but Jurgen smiled broadly anyway, curdling the expression of the constable even more, if that were possible. Winifred appeared to notice him for the first time. "Larrabee, go and collect the Commissar's men and sort out the charge sheets." "Ma'am?" He acknowledged her order with a manifest lack of enthusiasm that would have got any trooper in the guard a stiff talking to at the very least, and slouched off in the direction of the cells. "You'd better go with him," I told Jurgen. "Make sure they behave themselves." "Sir?" He trotted off behind the constable, who seemed to move a little faster as his new companion approached, leaving me alone with Winifred. I'd been hoping for a little friendly conversation, even a mild flirtation or two, but her mind was entirely on business that morning, and I had to make do with a smile and the offer of a mug of recaf. "Let me guess," I said as I scanned the data slates and let them read my thumbprint to confirm that I'd taken charge of the recidivists in the name of the Commissariat. "Drunk and disorderly, lewd conduct, and a couple of brawls." Winifred's mouth quirked with what looked like genuine amusement. "You obviously know your men well," she said dryly. She sipped her mug of recaf. "I know these ones a bit too well," I said, scanning the 5 names, which between them made up a good 10% of my workload. That might not sound much to you, but in a battery of over 300 guardsmen, it was a pretty impressive achievement in its own way. "Hoken, Nordstrom, Milson, Jarvik." And I raised my head to stare disapprovingly at the leading trooper as the small knot of men emerged sheepishly from the cells. "And the inevitable Gunnar Elson." He grinned at me with the abashed expression I'd become all too familiar with over the last couple of years. "Tell me, Elson, are you planning to make latrine orderly a full-time career?" He shrugged. "We serve the Emperor as our talents direct," he quoted, eliciting a handful of sniggers from among his compatriots. "Where you're concerned, he delegates to me," I riposted. The custodians looked a little surprised at the informality of the exchange, but I felt no obligation to enlighten them. Elson had saved my life back on Desolatia, picking off a Tyranid gargoyle which was swooping on me from behind, and was under the fond illusion that I cut him a little more slack as a result. In actual fact, he was completely mistaken about this, but I did nothing to disabuse him or anyone else of the notion, being keenly aware that if the rest of the troopers believed that looking out for the Commissar's welfare would rebound to their own advantage, I stood a much better chance of enjoying a long and successful career. I swept an evaluating eye over the little knot of troopers. All right, Nordstrom, who started it? Of all of them, Nordstrom was visibly by far the worst for wear. The others might have been hungover still, but were at least able to function. Jarvik and Håkon had to hold him up between them, and he seemed to focus on the sound of my voice with a visible effort. I'm not sure, sir. He managed to slur after a moment. Star what? Milson and Elson exchanged glances and sniggered. If anyone had more clearly been in a brawl, I had yet to meet them. Nordstrom's knuckles were bruised and bloodied, his face showing visible contusions, and as his torn, unfastened shirt swung open, I caught sight of a dressing patch at the bottom of his ribcage. Is that a knife wound? I asked, unable to keep a sudden flare of concern from my voice. If it was, the ensuing paperwork would take up the rest of the day, but Winitha shook her head. No, it's superficial. It was hardly even bleeding when we found him. And where was that? I asked. She shrugged. An alley off Harvest Street. No surprise there. It was right in the middle of the area most of the newer residents plied their trade in. A couple of square blocks of taverns, gambling dens and bordellos which had sprung up like mushrooms in the shadow of the Agricultural Records Office, to the great discomfiture of the administratum adepts who worked there. At least so they said. It was those Grox fondlers in the Crescent Moon, Jarvik said. I bet you. The others nodded, muttering dangerously. They put something in your drink and rob you blind when you keel over. It sounded like nothing more than barrack room gossip to me, but Milson was nodding eagerly in agreement. It's true. They did the same thing to me a couple of weeks back. I glanced at Winitha, who shrugged. Wouldn't surprise me if he did get rolled, she said. We're always scraping drunken guardsmen off the streets around there, and they've usually been picked clean by the time we get to them. I wasn't drunk, Wilson asserted vehemently. Well, not very. Not that much anyway. I know how to hold me ale.
I'll be right back. I gotta go over the filling.
Most of the entries in the voluminous file I had on him were for minor infractions involving civic property and small items he'd found lying around somewhere, rather than excessive intoxication. I returned my attention to Nordstrom. Nordstrom, I said slowly, trying to get him to concentrate. What's the last thing you remember? His brow furrowed. Go and fight. That much was obvious. And judging by the condition he was in, I'd be surprised if he remembered any of the details. But Winitha pounced on the opening. Who with? Once again, Nordstrom's face contorted with the effort of thinking. So, he said at last. Thawin? How about before that? I suggested. This all seemed like a waste of time to me, but I supposed Winitha had to at least make an effort to investigate what went on a few hundred meters from her sector house. And the longer I lingered, the more I could appreciate her company, and the more time there was for Mostrou to leave for brigade headquarters without dragging me along to whatever little surprise he had planned. There was a girl, wasn't there? Milson interrupted. With purple hair. I glared at him to try and shut him up, but Nordstrom was nodding. The ghost of a smile appeared on his face. Kirella. For a moment, a similar dreamy expression descended on Milson too. Maze and tattoos. I knew it. Milson looked triumphant. The last thing I remember before coming round in the alley is buying her a drink. Ring any bells? I asked Winitha, who was also nodding, but with purposeful recognition. Sounds like one of the local Joy girls. Works out of the Crescent Moon. There! That proves it! Jarvik said. He glanced meaningfully at his friends. Someone should go around there and sort them out. It was pretty clear from the tone of his voice who he had in mind for the job. I had no objection to that in principle, having found other establishments more congenial for my own recreational purposes, but this was edging into the realm of things I didn't want to know about because they'd make my job more complicated if I did. So I cut in quickly before they said anything which sounded like a positive plan of action. After all, if I didn't know about any potential trouble, I could hardly be expected to head it off, could I? I think we can safely leave that in the hands of the custodians, I said with all the authority I could muster. To his credit, Yarvik took the hint and shut up, although I would have laid a small wager that the next time I came to town, I'd find the Crescent Moon's windows boarded up at the very least. Worth shaking the tree, I suppose, Winifred said to my vague surprise. She looked at the constable she'd addressed before. Larrabee, keep an eye on things while I'm gone. She gestured to her other colleague, whose name I never caught, with a brusque jerk of her head. You're with me. After a pace or two, she paused and smiled at me. Commissar? It was one of your men who made the complaint after all. I was a little taken aback, I don't mind admitting. And had I realized what I was letting myself in for, I would have loaded my collection of defaulters aboard the truck outside and headed back to the battery as fast as I could, and taken my chances with Mostru. But it seemed like a harmless enough way of wasting a couple of hours on a pleasant spring morning, and there was always the possibility of a little time alone with Winifred, so I found myself nodding in agreement. Good idea, Sergeant. It'll save us having to bounce reports and data files off each other for the rest of the week. I glanced disapprovingly at the little group of disheveled gunners, and give Nordstrom a chance to pull himself together before we leave. I could see from the covert glances that the troopers exchanged I'd done the right thing there, reinforcing my carefully constructed facade of being firm but fair. Then I strolled out of the building to join Winifred, savoring the sweet spring sunshine for the last time that day. The Crescent Moon was a seedy-looking establishment at the best of times, which was after dark with the flare of pink and blue luminators flashing to lure the indiscriminating customer inside. In daylight, it looked even worse. The peeling paint on the shutters and crumbling plascrete of the facade was a foretaste of the cheap wooden furnishings and even cheaper liquor on sale inside. There were some suspicious-looking stains on the pavement next to the waste bins that I took pains to give a wide berth to as Winifred hammered on the door with the butt of her las pistol. "Custodians, open up!" she yelled, with surprising volume for a woman so small. After a few seconds of nothing happening, she repeated the procedure, attracting the attention of a small gaggle of passing administratum drones that glanced at us furtively and started muttering to each other that it was about time somebody did something about that dreadful place. The door remained resolutely shut. "Oh dear! There doesn't seem to be anyone in!" Winifred said loudly, sarcasm dripping from every syllable. She turned to the constable, who had drawn his own sidearm with an anticipatory glint in his eye. "We'll have to blow the hinges off!" Someone had evidently been listening, because there was a sudden rattling of bolts, and the door creaked open slightly to reveal an unhealthy-looking individual in badly fitting clothes and a barman's apron, which might originally have been some kind of color under its patchwork of stains. "Oh wait, my mistake." "Yes," the man said, his hunched posture making his ingratiating tone sound even more insincere than it undoubtedly was. "How can I help you, officers?" His voice trailed off uncertainly as he caught sight of me for the first time. Whatever he'd been expecting, an Imperial Guard commissar certainly wasn't it. "And Commissar?" "Caiaphas Kane." I introduced myself, hoping that something of my reputation had preceded me, a pretty safe bet given the number of guardsmen among the clientele. A slight widening of his eyes suggested that it had indeed done so, but before I could capitalize on it, Winifred took charge again. "Kamala Dobrovelski, we want a quiet word." Winifred pushed past him without ceremony. "She works here, right?" "Yes, she does." The barman scuttled after us, agitation oozing from every pore. "But the management is in no way responsible for any actions by members of staff which contravene—" "Shut it!" The new voice confused me for a moment, until I realized the constable had spoken. Until then, I'd vaguely assumed he was mute. "Just tell us where she is." "Upstairs." The barman's eyes were fixed on the las pistols in the hands of the two custodians. I glanced around, finding nothing that looked like a threat. The establishment was as shabby as I'd anticipated, looking more like a downhive drinking den than something you'd expect to find on an agri-world. But I guess their customers weren't paying for sophisticated decor. "Thank you. Your cooperation has been noted," Winifred said dryly. We left the barman goggling after us and headed for the door in the back of the room with a crudely lettered sign stapled to it saying "Staff Only." Behind it, a corridor led to the back of the building, presumably to a storage area, and, judging by the smell, either a kitchen or a waste dump. In a place like that, it was hard to tell the difference, along with a rickety flight of stairs which ascended sharply to the left. "This must be it," I said. Winifred agreed and led the way up the stairs, which ran into a corridor running
Did I
length
freeze
of the
again?
building lined with simple wooden doors. The three of us looked at each other and shrugged.
Yeah, I froze again. Oh crap. Test. Test. What? Testing. Alright, so that's freaking out.
Just unhook that. Try to fix that.
One at a time, I suggested. "No need." Winifred jerked a thumb at the door to a nearby room a few meters along from us. It had a small ceramic plate adhering to it, with a picture of a fat pink pony in a ballet dress, and Camilla's room written underneath in wobbly letters that were presumably supposed to look like they'd been done in crayon. This must be it. Before I could say anything humorous about her powers of deduction, she turned suddenly and kicked the thin wooden panel from its hinges. A feminine shriek of surprise and outrage confirmed that we'd found our quarry, and the constable and I followed the sergeant quickly through the wreckage of the door. "Kamila Dobrovelski?" she asked, although the question was only a formality. The girl sitting up in the rumpled bed matched Milson's description perfectly. Purple hair tumbling around a narrow face, twisted with shock and anger. "Get some clothes on. You're coming with us." "What for?" She began to comply with ill grace, revealing a body entwined with tattoos of a strange but compelling design, just as Nordstrom had said. Despite myself, I couldn't resist studying them, taking in how they accentuated the curves of her body, and as I did so, I felt the palms of my hands beginning to tingle. Always a reliable warning from my subconscious that something isn't quite right. She looked up and glared at me. "Enjoying the view, Caiaphas?" "I didn't know you'd met," Winifred said, switching her attention to me, her tone the temperature of a Valhallan midwinter morning. "We haven't," I said. The faint narrowing of the Joy Girl's eyes as I spoke was enough to tell me that she realized the slip of the tongue had just given her away. And now that the subconscious hint I'd noticed before was hammering against my forebrain, it was obvious there was something not quite right about her musculature, which the tattoos were designed to obscure. But I did tell the barman my name. I began to draw my chainsword. "And stealers communicate telepath." With an inhuman screech, Kamila sprang from the bed, faster than I would have believed possible, barging into the constable who was still blocking the doorway. He tried to bring up his sidearm, but was too close. Camilla's jaw elongated somehow, revealing a mouthful of razor-sharp fangs which clamped down on his throat, shearing through flesh and cartilage and decorating the shabby room with a bright spray of crimson. "Emperor on Earth!" Winifred snapped off a shot, the lasbolt punching a hole through the shoddy partition wall next to its head as the shrieking hybrid turned from the spasming body of the constable back towards us. Beyond it, I could hear feet in the corridor outside. Even though I couldn't see the owners, the sound had a peculiar scuttling quality which raised the hairs on the back of my neck. The chainsword cleared the scabbard, and I swung it desperately as Kamila leapt again. "It's a whole nest of them!" I parried a strike from a hand tipped with talon-like fingernails, feeling the blade bite through chitinous skin, and ducked as those murderous jaws snapped closed a handspan from my face. Winifred fired again, and for a moment I thought she'd missed, until I realized she was holding off the rest of the brood. Clearly, I'd have to finish this on my own. I swept the humming blade back in a counterstrike, taking the hybrid in the thorax and severing the spinal column. Foul-smelling ichor gushed, reminding me uncomfortably for a moment of the gaunts I'd faced on Desolatia, and the thing that had called itself Camilla dropped at my feet. "We're boxed in!" Winifred yelled. It certainly looked that way. The narrow cubicle was windowless, the only doorway crowded with horribly distorted parodies of humanity howling for our blood. She was placing her shots with care, picking off any foolish enough to show themselves directly with lasbolts to the head or chest, and pumping rounds through the thin wall from time to time to keep them from rushing the narrow space. I glanced around, a desperate plan beginning to form in my head. "Keep them off as long as you can," I yelled, swinging the humming blade at the thin wooden wall separating us from the adjoining cubicle. It bit hungrily, whining loudly as wood chips sprayed the room, and in seconds I'd carved a hole large enough to accommodate us. I jumped through, holding my humming weapon up, ready to block an attack from the other side of the wall as I emerged, but the room beyond turned out to be unoccupied, and Golden Throne be praised, bright morning sunshine illuminated a shabby bedroom almost identical to the one we'd just left through a window so grubby it might almost have been opaque. Nevertheless, it was the work of a moment to smash the glass with the pommel of the chainsword and dive through, heedless of the drop beyond, while Winifred sent a fusillade of parting shots through the gap behind us to delay our pursuers. I hit the pavement hard, heedless of the jolt that drove the breath from my lungs, relaxing to absorb the impact with the instinct hammered into me by years on the assault courses of the Schola Progenium, and turned, drawing my own las pistol. A moment later, Winifred hit the ground beside me, and I peppered the window above us with vindictive enthusiasm, blowing the head off a thick-set male from his shoulders. As he fell, I noticed a third arm growing from his right shoulder, tipped with razor-sharp talons. "How many of these freaks are there?" I asked rhetorically, as the barman who'd let us in emerged from the door and levelled a stubber at us. Winifred took him down with a snapshot to the gut before he could fire, and we looked at one another with grim understanding sparking between us. "More than we can handle." More of the grotesques were emerging from the shadows of the alleyways, moving with a coordinated purpose that was all the more unnerving for taking place in complete silence. With a chill which raised the hairs on my neck, I realized that there were normal-looking humans among them too, carriers of the gene-stealer taint, doomed to birth more of these monstrous hybrids with their wills already warped by the telepathic influence of the brood. I recognized one of the Administratum drones who'd passed us earlier, a piece of piping in his hands, advancing on us with murder in his eyes, a chilling contrast to the prissy bureaucrat of a few moments before. "Pull back," I suggested, suiting the action to the word and sprinting in the direction of the sector house, drawn to the promise of protection beneath the spreading wings of the Aquila on the facade like a penitent to the confessional. Not that I've been anywhere near one since the Schola kicked me out, and I hardly ever told the truth in one while I was there, but you know what I mean. Winifred was with me, stride for stride, and our las pistols cracked in unison, striking down the cultists who were angling across the mouth of the street to cut us off. She activated her personal vox as we ran. "Larrabee, break out the weapons, we're coming in hot." All I could hear of the reply was the faint echo of static that told me her earpiece was activated, but her expression was enough to keep me appraised of the other end of the conversation. "We've uncovered a stealer cult. Inform the divisional office and the local guard units." Her voice caught for a moment. "No, he's dead. Just me and the commissar." I missed the next exchange because I was busy ducking a frenzied rush from a hybrid wielding a length of chain. I blocked it with the chainsword, slicing it through, and riposted with a desperate swing that took his head off. Good thing, too. It was remarkably ugly, with far too much tongue. When I regained my balance, Winifred was looking at me. "Are your men reliable?" Well, that was debatable, really, but under the circumstances, I'd expect them to act like the soldiers they were, so I just nodded. Winifred activated her vox again. "Arm the troopers." A pause. "I don't care how hungover they are, even if all they can do is remember which way to point the gun, they're better than nothing." "They'll do a lot better than that," I said, stung at the implied slur on the men I served with. True, they were rear echelon warriors rather than frontline fighting troops. Give them an earthshaker or two and they'd flatten a city block neat as you please, but small arms weren't really their speciality. On the other hand, they practiced assiduously on the shooting range. Mostru saw to that, as he did every other regulation, and Earlson at least was a pretty fair marksman, as I could attest from the mere fact that I was still breathing. And don't forget they'd fought off the Nids on Desolatia, so even if they weren't exactly battle-hardened veterans, they'd already proved they could fight up close and personal if they needed to. So, all in all, I felt pretty confident in their abilities. I hope so. Winither took down the last of the cultists between us and the sector house, and we started across the open square towards it. Our boot soles rang on the flagstones, echoes rising from the facades of the encircling administratum blocks, and small chips of stone began to kick up around us, preceded by the distinctive crack of ionized air which accompanies a las weapon discharge and the deeper bark of a stubber or two. Despite myself, I turned to look behind us, loosing off a couple of shots myself in the vague hope of keeping our assailants' heads down, then redoubled my efforts to reach the sector house. My worst fears had been realized. The cultists had been joined by a handful of men in the uniform of the local militia who were armed with standard-issue lasguns, and several of the hybrids had produced personal firearms of one kind or another. There were more of them than I could have dreamed possible, dozens of twisted monstrosities crowding into the square from all directions, converging on us with a grim fixity of purpose that clenched my bowels. "Militia renegades!" I gasped, feeling the air begin to rasp in my lungs. I couldn't keep this pace up for much longer, but to falter meant being torn apart by the mob of inhuman hybrids behind us. They surged on like a malevolent tide, untiring and implacable, uncannily reminiscent of the tyrannid swarms that had forged their foul purpose and sent them out to infiltrate the Imperium. "This is just getting better and better," Winither smiled grimly and dropped one of our leading pursuers. The others didn't even falter, flowing around it like water around a rock. Another group was just clearing the corner of the sector house, angling in to cut us off from our refuge. A lasbolt, more accurate than the rest, caught the hem of my greatcoat, tugging at it like an importunate child. "Aim for the shooters," I counselled. If we couldn't at least throw their aim off, they'd have us cold in seconds. If they'd been proper guard troopers, we'd have been dead already, of course, and I found myself thanking the Emperor for the habitual sloppiness of the planet's defense force, which, like most professional soldiers, I usually found so irritating. Especially while trying to coordinate with them on the battlefield. It went without saying that on the few occasions we'd been forced to cooperate with the local forces, Colonel Mostrew had been only too pleased to delegate this onerous task to me, and I'd had no choice but to comply with as much good grace as I could muster. Of all the varied duties of a commissar, I've always found liaising with local militia among the most irritating. We turned in unison, aiming as best we could, but under the circumstances I didn't expect much. At the very best, we were only delaying the inevitable until our pursuers closed. But I've always found that when you truly believe you only have seconds left to live, each one becomes so precious you become determined to eke them out for as long as possible, whatever the cost. We fired as one, expecting little effect, but to my astonishment, the renegade troopers were falling, breaking, and running for cover. "Cowards!" I bellowed, carried away with adrenaline and the reckless bravado of imminent death. "Stand and fight like men, damn you!" "Are you mad?" Winither was staring at me in astonishment, and I whipped my chainsword up into a defensive posture, ready to take on the first wave of hybrids that was already leaping towards us, inhuman jaws agape. "Run, you idiot!" Only then did I realize that several of our would-be assailants were falling, bloody craters exploding across their chests, and the distinctive crack of lasfire was coming from behind us now. Instinct took over once again, and I followed her advice, finding the square behind us littered with the corpses of the cultists who had tried to cut us off. "This way, Commissar! Hurry!" Jurgen's familiar voice urged me on, and as I looked up at the sector house, now tantalizingly close, I caught sight of him crouched behind one of the columns supporting the portico, a lasgun raised and spitting death at the horde of cultists behind us. A moment later, I noticed another muzzle flash and made out Erlson similarly positioned, picking off one target after another with smooth precision. He caught sight of me and grinned, no doubt enjoying himself hugely. Larrabee was by the doors, the blue of his custodes uniform standing out starkly against the rich polished wood, blazing away on full auto without even the pretense of expertise. But the crush of distorted bodies was so great, aiming wasn't strictly necessary. Wherever he pointed his weapon, hybrids and human cultists alike fell like wheat before harvesters. With Jurgen's encouragement ringing in my ears, I put on a final spurt, vaguely surprised to find that a small part of my mind was still able to appreciate the rear view of Winither bounding up the steps a few meters ahead of me. and then, almost before my senses could register it, I was surrounded by the cool marble foyer of the sector house. I turned back to find Larrabee closing the doors, while Jurgen and Erlson backed through them, still firing on the frenzied mob which was by now cresting the steps outside and bounding over their fallen comrades in a single-minded attempt to reach the narrowing gap. They almost made it at that. The door stopped, centimetres from closing, blocked by a chitinous arm, tipped by 3 scythe-like talons, which gouged a deep groove from the thick hardwood as it flailed around for purchase. The 2 gunners leapt to assist the constable, putting their shoulders to the wood, but even with all 3 of them straining every muscle, the sheer weight of the tide of bodies behind it began to force the doors open again. I slashed down with the humming chainsword, severing the obscene limb that dropped to the floor, thrashing and leaking foul-smelling ichor, and the door slammed to. Larrabee triggered the locking mechanism, and thick steel bolts slammed home, securing it behind us. "What the hell did you think you were playing it at there?" Winifred was glaring at me, a complex mixture of emotions on her face. "Were you trying to get yourself killed?" There was no point in admitting I'd been so far gone I hadn't even noticed our comrades had opened up a corridor to safety for us, so I just shrugged. "Well, you know," I said, "ladies first." The effect was quite gratifying, I have to say. She hugged me briefly, failing to find any words, and turned away, already assessing our situation like the professional she was. Erlson and Larrabee were looking at me with undisguised admiration, and I was suddenly sure, correctly as it turned out, that suitably embroidered reports of my gallantry and heroism would be all over the sector before the week was over. I turned to Jurgen, who was taking in the scene outside with his usual phlegmatic manner. "What's our situation?" I asked. "Fracked," Erlson muttered, before turning back to the nearest window, beginning to amuse himself by taking pot-shots at the abominations outside. Fortunately, the custodians tend to the sort of caution I was later to acquire, and the place was constructed to withstand a siege quite comfortably. The windows were narrowed and placed to provide excellent firing positions. "Pretty defensible," Jurgen said, ignoring him. "We could do with a couple of full squads to cover everything, though. We're spread pretty thin." "Might as well wish for a chapter of Astartes while you're at it," I said, but as usual my aide was immune to sarcasm, and he just nodded. "That would be nice," he agreed. "Where are the others?" I asked. Jurgen gestured towards the rear of the building. "Milson's covering the back door. He found some grenades in the armory and he's booby-trapping the entrance. Hokin's with him. Jarvik's up on the roof." "What about Nordstrom?" I asked. "Still sleeping it off?" "I don't know." Jurgen looked confused for a moment. "I thought he was with us." "A building this size, he could be anywhere," I said. Before we could speculate further, the sound of lasfire cut across the silence. Drawing the obvious conclusion, I glanced across at Erlson, but he was in the middle of reloading and looked as puzzled as the rest of us. "That came from inside." Winifred led the rush back towards the rear of the building. The firing intensified for a moment, then ended with a gurgling scream that raised the hairs on the back of my neck. Too impatient to wait for the counter to retract, I vaulted over it, landing heavily, and found myself facing the door to the rear of the building, through which Jurgen and Larrabee had disappeared to fetch the others, what seemed like a lifetime ago, but which my chronometer stubbornly insisted had been little more than an hour. "Protect the brood!" Nordstrom appeared through the gap, a blood-stained combat knife gripped in his hand, his eyes as vacant as those of the infected humans outside. The full significance of the apparently trivial wound on his chest suddenly became clear to me. I sidestepped his swing, blocking reflexively with the chainsword, and took his hand off at the wrist. To my amazement, he didn't even slow down, spinning to strike at my eyes with the extended fingers of his other hand. I ducked my head just in time, feeling the impact against my skull, barely cushioned by my cap, and heard his fingers break an instant before the crack of a las pistol next to my ear told me that Winifred was still watching my back. As he fell, she ran past me, sprinting for the end of the corridor. A lasbolt took her in the shoulder, spinning her back into my arms. I glanced at the wound, noting in passing that it was already cauterized, so at least she wouldn't bleed to death, before handing her back to Larrabee. Milson was at the far end of the corridor, his lasgun aimed at us, a dozen or so frag grenades crudely wired to the thick wooden door behind him. A faint scrabbling sound betrayed the presence of our assailants beyond it, still determined to break through. Hokin's body was lying between us in a pool of blood, clearly beyond any medical aid. "Cease fire, you idiot!" I yelled. "It's us!" I know. The emotionless timbre of his voice warned me what he was about to do, even before my conscious mind registered the blankness of his stare. "Back!" I yelled to the others, even as he detonated the explosives, blowing the thick wooden door to splinters and himself to perdition. A shrieking tide of malformed malevolence burst through the gap, jaws gaping, talons extended to rend and tear. A volley of lasfire from all of us blasted into the first rank, but those behind just kept coming, barely slowed by the obstruction of their fallen fellows. "Fire and movement!" It was a desperate gamble, but one we just made, taking it in turns to shoot down the front rank of hybrids while the rest of our party retreated to the stairwell leading to the roof. Even Winitha managed to keep firing, her face pale with shock as Larrabee helped her up the staircase to safety. It was a close-run thing, mind, and we'd never have got away with it if the corridor hadn't been so narrow. Even now I break out in a cold sweat at the thought of how things could have gone if the monsters had been able to close a little faster, or our fire had been a little more attenuated. "Up here, Commissar!" I grabbed the proffered hand gratefully, Erlson hauling me clear of the stairwell just as Jarvik lobbed a couple of grenades down among the seething mass of chitin, and Jurgen slammed the heavy steel fire door closed. The dull thud of the explosion shook the metal as I leaned against it, and Larrabee locked it closed. I gasped, the fresh air of the outside hitting my lungs like pure oxygen, leaving me momentarily giddy from the reaction. "They seem pretty steamed," Jarvik said, glancing over the side of the roof and taking a random potshot into the crowd for luck. I followed his gaze, and the breath seemed to freeze in my throat. We were surrounded now by what seemed to be hundreds of the monstrosities, lapping around our flimsy refuge like the incoming tide round a sandcastle. In that moment, I knew we were doomed, that all we could hope to do was stave off the inevitable. "Look, sir!" Jurgen was pointing at something, a grin of imbecilic delight on his face, and for a moment I thought he'd gone mad under the strain. Then I saw it too, the unmistakable silhouette of an Imperial chimera, and behind it, another. "It's the Cadians!" Sure enough, the column of armoured vehicles bore the crest of the Cadian 101st, an elite assault regiment that had just arrived in the sector from the victorious campaign in the north. Hard luck for them to be thrown straight back into the fighting, I thought at the time, but as it turned out, it was just as well they were the closest guard unit and the first to respond to the message Winitha had ordered Larrabee to send. The unmistakable rattle of heavy bolters burst across the square like thunder, scything the milling abominations down where they stood. We joined in enthusiastically from our perch on the roof, pouring down fire from above, watching in undisguised relief as the tide of obscenity broke in disorder. The thudding and scrabbling against the metal door died away as the brood realized it was facing a far greater threat than us and turned to meet it. "Well done, Kai." Davis looked at the gleaming new medal on my coat with barely suppressed envy. As usual, he was the only one present to use the familiar form of my given name, and from the corner of my eye I noticed Winitha, her dress uniform augmented by a sling which made her look fascinatingly Amazonian, grin as she picked up on my thinly disguised irritation. "Looks like you got all the fun again." "It wasn't the same without you," I assured him, straight-faced. I glanced across at Erlson, who was looking surprisingly subdued, considering he was supposed to be another of the guests of honour. "I expected you to be a bit happier under the circumstances, Erlson. Free drink, all the food you can eat." "I know. It's these." He fingered the freshly sewn bombardier's stripes on his sleeve moodily. "They're kind of inhibiting." "Don't worry," I assured him. "Knowing you, I doubt you'll keep them for long." "Well, there is that," he said, looking markedly more cheerful and wandering off to investigate the buffet. "What the six of you did," Davis persisted. "If you hadn't found the cult, they would have infected every guard unit on the continent eventually, and we'd have lost the war. It doesn't bear thinking about." "Then don't," I said. I was still getting reports in from the purges going on in practically every regiment on the planet, dozens of men executed for the taint they carried without even having been aware of the fact, and it left a sour taste in my mouth. I turned to Winitha, desperate for a distraction. "Care to dance?" "To begin with," she agreed. Traitor's Gambit.
Editorial note. This is one of the longer fragments scattered throughout the Kane archive, and as it's reasonably self-contained, I've resisted the temptation to incorporate it into the more comprehensive account of his activities during this period that I'm currently compiling. Amberley Vale, Ordo Xenos.
As I've mentioned before in the course of these memoirs, my life has held more than its fair share of surprises. One of the rare pleasant ones had been my appointment to the position of Commissarial Liaison Officer to the staff of the Lord General, apparently at the instigation of Zyvan himself. We'd always got on tolerably well, and I suppose he liked the idea of furthering our acquaintance under more congenial circumstances. Of course, I still found myself dragged off to one war zone after another, but at least being attached to the upper echelons kept me away from the noise a bit more than hitherto. Not as much as I'd have liked, of course, as my duties still took me a lot closer to the battlefront than Zyvan usually ventured, and the nature of the posting meant that Amberley was able to find me more easily whenever she had a particularly life-threatening errand to drop in my lap. But I can't deny her more frequent appearances had a definite upside too.
I'm pleased to hear it.
So, by the early weeks of 990, life was looking pretty good to me. We'd just arrived in the Deepwater system, along with a naval task force and a couple of dozen troop transports, ostensibly to show the flag and reassure our loyal citizens that the forces of the Emperor stood ever ready to protect them from the rapacious ambitions of the Tau. Although, as usual, the aliens had managed to persuade a sizable chunk of the population that they'd be better off embracing the greater good and defecting en masse. At least the situation hadn't deteriorated as badly as it had done on Gravilax, but things were getting uncomfortable enough for the local governor to seem heartily pleased at our arrival. To my surprise, I was quite favourably impressed by the man the first time we met. I've come across a number of planetary governors in the course of my erratic progress around the galaxy, and on the whole, the ones who weren't incompetent were either corrupt, insane, or both. On at least one occasion sufficiently so to have mortgaged their soul and the world they administered to the forces of the ruinous powers. There have been exceptions, however, and Landon Hoy was definitely one of those. A vigorous man of about my own age, whose greying temples imparted an air of wisdom and gravitas to his bearing, and who ruled his fiefdom in the Emperor's name with what seemed to me to be a reasonable degree of competence and integrity.
Kane's age was almost a century by this point, although, given the degree of vagueness about Kane's origins and the amount of time he spent traveling the warp, that's more of a best guess than an accurate estimate. One thing we can be certain of from this description is that, like Kane, Hoy had benefited from a Juvenat treatment or two.
Unusually for a civilian, he'd been able to grasp the tactical implications of the situation when Zyvan and I pointed them out to him on our first, and as things turned out only, visit to the gubernatorial palace. As the name implied, Deepwater was an aquatic world, with no land at all to speak of apart from the occasional island chain, so most of the population lived in hive cities anchored to the seabed. From these routes, the spires soared into the air above, often for a kilometre or more, to form glass and steel reefs capable of withstanding anything the elements were capable of throwing at them. A warren of tunnels and mine shafts sprawled out from the underhives to pillage the rich store of minerals lying beneath the waves, and periodically threaten the occasional sump community with drowning when they breached. A hiver myself, I found the place a strange mixture of the comfortably nostalgic and the outlandish, savouring the salt tang in the air as an honour guard of Hoy's household troops escorted us through the tapestry-shrouded corridors towards our destination. A larger contingent of Zyvan's personal guard trotted in our wake, keeping them covered. The Lord General hadn't risen to his current eminence by being overly reckless, and was all too aware of how big a gift his sudden removal would be to the enemies of him on Earth. Hoy received us in a well-appointed room below the waterline, where couches upholstered in powder-blue silk were arranged to give the best possible view of the fish swimming around the reef, beyond the thick sheet of ambergris forming the far wall. The spectacle was stunning, but I was too seasoned a campaigner to have my attention diverted that easily, and shook the hand of our host with an easy assurance. I thought that would best match the mental picture he undoubtedly had of a hero of the Imperium. He returned it firmly, then bowed formally to Zyvan. "I can't deny I'm pleased to see you," he said, reseating himself on a sofa and gesturing a servitor forward to offer drinks. I selected an amasec from the array of decanters on the tray, finding it surprisingly indifferent, but masked my disappointment easily. "The Xenoists have been gaining ground among the populace, in spite of everything we do to discourage them. If nothing else, your arrival means they can't keep spreading the lie that we've been abandoned by the Imperium." "And you won't be," Zyvan assured him, clearly finding the amasec no more palatable than I did. The Tau Empire had managed to annex several Imperial systems in the region over the last few years simply because, with the growing menace of the Tyranid hive fleets, we hadn't had the resources to defend them properly. In fact, if the Nids hadn't been as much of a problem for them as they were for us, they'd probably have wrapped up half the sector by now.
Something of an exaggeration, but they'd certainly have made significant gains.
Enough was enough, and Deepwater was where we decided to draw the line. The resources extracted here were vital both militarily and economically. If it fell, we'd all be feeling the pinch. "I'm glad to hear it," Hoy said, with a nod towards the pile of papers on a small table close to his elbow. They were too far away for me to read from where I was sitting, but I didn't need to anyway, as I'd authorized their release to him personally. It had simply been meant as a gesture of trust, and the idea that he'd actually bothered to read the material was as much a surprise to me as it clearly was to Zyvan. "Especially as it seems you're needed in other systems too." "That still remains to be seen," I said cautiously. The star cluster of which Deepwater was part of was far too vulnerable to a sudden Tau attack for my peace of mind. Or Zyvan's too, come to that. So the strategy we determined on was the old one of a mobile defense, moving from system to system as unpredictably as possible. The Tau couldn't know which system the fleet would be in next, and would have to mount an invasion force sufficiently powerful to overcome it wherever they tried. Even if we weren't there when they arrived, the existing defences should be enough to bog them down long enough for our flotilla to respond and tip the balance in the Imperium's favour. We hoped. Of course, if our intelligence turned out to be wrong about the resources they had available, we'd be royally fracked. But I'd worry about that when the time came, if it ever did. At the moment, the protection of Deepwater is our highest priority. "I'd be interested in any suggestions you might have," Hoy said, ignoring the amasec and reaching for an unfamiliar drink at the back of the tray. He smiled. "Have a Nagila? I'm afraid our local amasec isn't up to much. Hardly anywhere to grow the grain, for one thing." I took the local beverage and sipped cautiously, finding it a great deal more appetizing than the contents of my abandoned glass. I thought briefly about asking what it was made from, then decided I probably didn't want to know. "Our first priority is to assess the state of readiness of the assets you already have in system," Zyvan said, as agreeably surprised as I was. He nodded at me. "That will be Commissar Kane's job. Once he's done that, we can institute any additional training measures that seem necessary. Purge the outstandingly incompetent officers, raise any additional manpower the PDF requires, and garrison a guard regiment or two here to make up any deficiencies which may remain." He regarded the governor seriously over the rim of his glass. "I trust you have no objection to that?" "None whatsoever," Hoy assured him. He returned his gaze to me. "In fact, I'm due to begin a tour of the off-world Hebs and Void stations the day after tomorrow. If you'd care to tag along, I'm sure you'll find my yacht a good deal more comfortable than a military shuttle." Well, it would have been churlish to refuse, and the thought of spending the best part of a month cooped up in an Aquila with Jurgen wasn't exactly the most congenial prospect I could imagine. So I made a brief show of consideration and nodded. "Thank you," I said, little realizing how wide of the mark my next 4 words were going to be. "That sounds very pleasant." My first impression of the wave crest did nothing to dispel the fond illusion that, for once, I'd fallen on my feet and could expect more of a luxury cruise than a tour of inspection. My stateroom was as lavishly appointed as anything I'd come to expect since joining Zyvan's staff, almost too much so the mattress on the bed being so yielding that climbing into it was more like being swallowed by a patch of tangle moss than an attempt to rest. After one sleepless night, troubled by dreams of being digested, I instructed Jurgen to remove it and found the more utilitarian padding of the frame far more to my liking. He nodded, and, to my relief, moved away from the grill of the circulator where he'd been basking in the frigid draught, allowing his remarkable body odour to roam the room freely.
Kane's aide was a Valhallan, and, like most ice worlders, found the temperatures most other Imperial citizens tend to favour sultry at best.
Jurgen wasn't exactly the most prepossessing soldier in the Imperial Guard. In fact, I'd seen troopers who'd been dead for several days and still looked more presentable than he did. That said, he possessed a number of qualities which made him the perfect aide, not the least of which was a literal-minded obduracy in following orders, coupled with an unshakable faith in my judgment second only to his reverence for the Emperor himself. He'd saved my life on more occasions than either of us could remember, although I tried not to bother him with anything which involved counting above 10, as I suspected that might involve the removal of his socks, a prospect to leave even an orc shuddering. "Mine was the same," he said, glaring at the offending mattress. "Wouldn't have had a wink of sleep if I hadn't turfed it on the floor." He had a small cabin adjacent to mine, an arrangement common to the guest quarters, where it seemed to be assumed that the occupants would require their valets, maids, coiffurists, or whatever kept readily to hand. I hadn't had occasion to venture inside, but the glimpses I'd had through the doorway had left me in no doubt that Jurgen had made himself as much at home as he ever did in a Hrud's nest of abandoned meals, discarded underwear and porno slates. I had no idea who was going to tidy up in there after we disembarked, but strongly suspected that whoever got the job would have severely hacked off their superior shortly before. Overstuffed mattresses notwithstanding, I found the bulk of the voyage as enjoyable as I'd anticipated. We spent almost a month ricocheting from one outpost to another, where Hoy would disembark to confer with the local administratum adepts, while I put the fear of the Emperor into whatever system defense force personnel I could find lounging about the place. In general, I have to admit, I was quite favourably impressed. They weren't up to the standard of Guard or Navy regulars, of course, or they'd have been swept up in the manpower tithes, but they were competent enough to give the tower bloody nose if push came to shove. Not for long, of course, they'd be overwhelmed in a matter of days, but the Blueies would know they'd been in a fight, and, Emperor willing, be weakened enough for our fleet to have the edge when we turned up to liberate the system again. Between outposts, we generally had 2 or 3 days coasting through open space, which were the next best thing to a holiday. I still had plenty of work to do, of course, remaining in Vox contact with Zyvan and keeping up to date with the latest intelligence reports, but as ever, Jurgen was an invaluable bulwark against the more onerous aspects of my job, deflecting most of the paperwork with his usual efficiency. That left me free to play the diplomatic game, mingling with the usual collection of aristocratic parasites and senior bureaucrats who accrete around a governor's household, and who were all gratifyingly aware of my unmerited reputation. By playing an adroit combination of the bluff old soldier and the modest hero, I was able to milk them for a fair amount of useful intelligence, which I duly passed on to Zyvan, and a couple of morsels of information about the most probable Tau sympathizers in positions of influence, which I sent straight to Amberley. Without doubt, though, the most agreeable aspect of the voyage was the chance to socialize with Hoy. He invited me to his quarters for dinner on several occasions, where Stein, his personal chef, demonstrated an ability with fish dishes bordering on genius.
Seafood being a staple of the deep-water diet, of course.
The meal over, we'd retire to the somewhat gaudy lounge where we'd play a game or two of regicide in front of the Armacris wall, giving onto a spectacular view of the Emperor's domain, and I'd exaggerate outrageously about my experiences in the front line of its defence. "It sounds a near miracle that you're here at all," Hoy said, knocking back his goblet of Nagila and glancing around for a refill. "Like another?" I glanced up from the regicide board, where I was on the verge of losing my 3rd game in a row, grateful for the distraction. I'd have preferred to get my tarot deck out, to tell the truth, but I had a feeling that the governor would consider that a rather vulgar pastime, and if he started getting competitive, I'd never be able to afford to match his bets anyway. "No thanks," I said, considering the offer. Nagila was all very well in its way, but it had a slightly cloying aftertaste, and I was beginning to miss the cleaner flavour of my favourite tipple. I'll take an amasec this time. If you're sure, Hoy said, looking faintly surprised and signalling for a servant. Usually there were none around, as he dismissed them all from his quarters after dinner. Unlike most aristos I've come across, he was sensible enough to realise that servants are people too, and liable to gossip about anything they've overheard. But I'd have thought you'd prefer something a little better than what we've got to offer. I do, I said, knowing him well enough by now to be certain that he wouldn't mistake candour for a slight against his homeworld. And I've got a particularly fine bottle in my quarters. If Zyvan was aware that it was missing from his personal stock, he'd been too polite to mention it. As this is our last night before making orbit again, I went on, I can't think of a better time to share it. Hoy nodded slowly. Once we got back to Deepwater, our respective duties would make it all but impossible to spend a convivial evening together again, so we might as well make the most of it while we could. By all means, he agreed, and pressed the switch on the arm of his chair again. The servants seemed to be taking an inordinate amount of time to respond. Have your men bring it round. I stood, a little more carefully than I'd anticipated. Nagila may not have been entirely to my taste, but there was no denying it was powerful stuff. I'll fetch it myself, I said. So far, I'd managed to keep Jurgen out of the governor's way, and felt it would be prudent if I continued to do so. Probably best, Hoy agreed, pressing the call button again with a hint of impatience. If he's anything like my staff, we could die of thirst before he got here. Quite, I agreed diplomatically, and slipped out of the governor's quarters. As the solid gold doors slid closed behind me, the palms of my hands began to itch. A presentiment I'd learned long ago not to ignore, even when, as now, there seemed no obvious reason for disquiet. Loosening my las pistol in its holster, I began to walk down the corridor, used by this time to the slightly springy sensation underfoot imparted by the luxuriant carpet. My footfalls were all but silent, and I strained my ears for any sound out of the ordinary. I could hear nothing unusual, although that brought little comfort. In my experience, it's what you don't notice that kills you. The circulators were humming quietly, and the constant thrumming of the engines, felt through the bones rather than heard, was as steady as ever. That was when it hit me. Not a sound out of place, but the absence of one. Ever since we'd boarded, I'd been aware of the faint murmur of a human presence, mingling with the other noises. Now that nebulous amalgam of distant voices, clattering tools, and the footfalls of the lowly, toiling in the uncarpeted regions of the ship had vanished completely. Certain by now that something had gone badly awry, I drew my sidearm and loosened my trusty chainsword in its scabbard. Rounding the next junction in the corridor, I tensed, seeing a flash of movement in the distance, then began to relax. Hoy's servants were responding to his summons at last, 3 of them, the gold highlights of their livery flashing as they caught the radiance of the overhead luminators. I was just on the brink of hailing them when something about the way they were moving started my palms tingling afresh. They were spread out, like an infantry team advancing into hostile territory, the 2 on the flanks glancing down each side corridor as they approached it, while the 3rd kept his gaze on the main passageway ahead. I just had time to register the comm bead in his ear and the las pistol gripped in his hands when our eyes locked. The odds hardly seemed fair. 3 to 1 it may have been, but I've spent a lifetime fending off attempts to kill me, generally by things a great deal more formidable than a gaggle of civilian insurrectionists who barely knew one end of a gun barrel from another. I hesitated for a fraction of a second, just to make sure I wasn't misreading the situation, but the moment the point man stopped gawking at me, he began to bring his pistol up, which just goes to show what a frack brain he was. I'd already got him in my sights and dropped him with a single shot before he could even come close to threatening me. The other 2 were a bit quicker off the mark, although neither seemed to have registered my presence until the snap of ionizing air from my lasbolt and the muffled thud of their friend hitting the carpet brought their heads round with identical expressions of stupefied astonishment. I couldn't take them both before they retaliated, though. They were too widely separated, so I cracked off a snapshot at the woman on the left, which, despite missing, made a nasty mess of some gaudy frescoes millimetres from her head, and dived for cover behind a pedestal supporting a marble bust of some dyspeptic-looking predecessor of Hoy's. The man on the right recovered first, returning fire with far more enthusiasm than accuracy, and going to ground behind a large ceramic urn, which my next las bolt shattered most satisfactorily. I followed up with a second as soon as I could squeeze the trigger again, blessing the extra speed and steadiness my augmetic fingers gave me, and he collapsed among the shards, a bloody crater punched neatly into his torso. Seeing him fall, the woman turned and fled towards the dubious refuge of the corridor she'd been investigating, crossing half the distance in a couple of panic-lengthened strides before my next bolt took the back of her head off.
Oof.
I stood, slowly, making sure they didn't have friends within earshot, and walked towards the trio of corpses, wondering what the hell was going on. It would have been flattering to think that I was their intended target, but the encounter had clearly been no more than random chance. If I hadn't had a sudden impulse to fetch the Amasec from my quarters, I'd have still been sitting across the regicide board from Hoy, blithely unaware of whatever was happening. I raised a hand to my ear before belatedly recalling that I'd left my combead in my quarters, along with instructions to Jurgen that I wasn't to be disturbed for anything less urgent than the sudden appearance of a Tau battle fleet. The scapegraces who'd attacked me were all well past the point of being able to give answers, something a cursory examination made all too clear, and I was on the point of turning away when a faint hissing sound drew my attention to the leader's earpiece, which by some miracle was still functioning. I picked it up and listened with interest. "Yennis, where are you?" a female voice asked, not for the first time judging by the petulant tone beginning to creep into it. "Team 3 respond. You should have met Craven in the governor's quarters by now." "None of your people can answer at the moment," I said, the residual adrenaline buzz from the skirmish combining with the Nagila still sloshing around my system to override my more cautious instincts. "They're a bit too busy being dead." "Who is this?" The voice was sounding more curious than irritable now, and I had the sudden unnerving sensation of having attracted the attention of a predator, which I'd last experienced in the underhives of Hope Springs just before the gene stealers started coming out of the walls. "No matter," I told myself, beginning to regret my moment of uncharacteristic bravado. Whoever was on the other end of the Vox-link could hardly talk me to death. "Commissar Kane," I said, injecting a dash of the insouciant self-assurance I liked to project in my younger days whenever there were impressionable young ladies in the room.
And the rest of his life, too. Although, by this point, it was more habit than a serious attempt at seduction. I'd certainly have known if it wasn't.
"And you would be entirely unconcerned," the voice replied, with what the owner no doubt hoped was withering scorn. Having survived the displeasure of a number of women over the years, including an inquisitor, the heiress to a planet and a sorceress who came back from the dead as a demon.
Hardly the most flattering company to have been lumped in with.
I was singularly unimpressed. "You'll be dead soon enough." "Forgive me if this sounds a little ungallant," I riposted, "but I've heard that before." I was already moving as I spoke, jogging back to Hoy's quarters, alert for any sound betraying the approach of another squad of turncoat retainers. I didn't think the woman would be stupid enough to issue orders to the rest of her brigands on the frequency we were using to converse, but I kept the channel open anyway on general principles. "Anna, this is Roxwell." A new voice broke in after a moment, and I blessed the lack of imagination of the average civilian. The earpieces they'd been issued with were on a preset frequency, so it hadn't occurred to anyone to change them. "The engineerium secured." "Bully for you," I cut in, scenting the chance for a bit of misdirection. "Let's see how long it takes me to loosen it up again." I hadn't the slightest intention of going anywhere near the place, of course, but with any luck my shadowy enemies would be so taken with my hollow reputation that they'd dig in there, expecting me to burst through the door, diverting enough reinforcements to pretty much give me the run of the rest of the ship, which, now I came to think about it, wasn't all that big, at least compared to the warp-going transports I'd spent so much of my life aboard. Besides, it was clear from the first thing I'd overheard that Hoy was either a target or involved in the conspiracy, and on the whole, the former was far more likely. If I could get to him before Craven, whoever the hell that was, with any luck he'd be able to give me some answers about whatever was going on. As I approached the governor's quarters, I slowed my pace, checking the charge in my las pistol's power pack and drawing my chainsword. The golden doors were open, and a cape of chill presentiment settled itself around my shoulders. On entering, a single glance was all it took to confirm my worst fears. The governor was dead, most of his torso seared away by an energy bolt of quite staggering power. I'd seen the damage done by plasma weapons often enough to recognize it, and felt an even stronger sense of foreboding than before. Whoever Hanar's people were, they were well-resourced. Plasma weapons were rare, to say the least, and the vast majority of them firmly in the hands of the Emperor's faithful servants. Palms tingling anew, I edged further inside, keeping my back to the wall and an eye on the door. My erstwhile drinking companion had clearly been taken by surprise, but hadn't gone down without a fight. There was another body sprawled across the carpet, dressed in the plain utilitarian uniform of a member of the ship's crew, the small, neat hole punched through his forehead, confirming the suspicion I'd long harboured that the ornate ring on Hoy's index finger was a digital weapon of some kind. I swept the room rapidly, but the mere fact that my head was still attached to my shoulders was enough to confirm that the assassin had been alone. Besides which, if he'd had any companions with him, they would undoubtedly have recovered the weapon he'd dropped when Hoy took his final revenge. It was actually hard to tell who died first, as the final involuntary muscle spasm could have triggered either weapon. But given the manifest accuracy of Hoy's shot, my money would have been on the governor beating his assailant to the punch. Just his hard luck that Craven had been armed in the way he was. A las or auto pistol might well have missed Hoy altogether, but the plasma bolt had expanded as it travelled. I bent to pick up the assassin's handgun from the floor, rescabbarding my chainsaw to do so, although I'd have kissed an orc before I let go of my las pistol at that point. The handgun's smooth surface, devoid of devotional icons and the seals of sanctification bestowed by the tech priests, bespoke its unhallowed origins, and I was unable to suppress a shudder of revulsion as I closed my hand around it. It was of Tau origin. I'd seen enough of their Xenos tech over the years to be certain of that, and a grim conclusion began to force its way into my thoughts. Hoy's assassination was almost certainly a decapitation strike, intending to sow confusion and discord in advance of a Xenos invasion, which meant that an all-out attack on the Deepwater system must be imminent. I took a deep breath, forcing down my spiralling fears. I knew where the Vox room was from my periodic reports to Zyvan. All I had to do was reach it and warn the fleet. Of course, I'd have to make my way through an indeterminate number of Xenos sympathizers to get there, but I'd faced far worse odds than that before, and I was still around to tell the tale. Despite my misgivings, I tucked the plasma pistol into the sash at my waist before leaving the room, as gingerly as if it was a Greech egg.
A life form native to the Bannon system, most notable for its acidic blood, which is capable of eating through ceramite armor in a matter of seconds. Its eggs are full of the stuff, which makes handling them something of a risky business.
It was clear evidence of the Xenos involvement that would convince even the most skeptical of Zyvan's underlings, and I was sure Amberley would appreciate the chance to do whatever it is Inquisitors do with unhallowed artifacts.
That depends on the individual, of course. I tend towards safe disposal, but there are radicals out there unbalanced enough to actually use the things. Bad enough in my own ordo, but a truly terrifying prospect where the Malleus is concerned.
I was on the point of leaving when I noticed that the prostrate assassin had a comm bead in his ear as well, and, struck by an idea, retuned the one I'd confiscated from the late and unlamented Yanis. "Craven, are you receiving?" Hanar's voice came through almost at once, and I smiled grimly to myself as I slipped out of the room. No harm in dividing the opposition up even further, I thought. By the time they responded, I'd be long gone. "Hello again, Hanar," I said. "Craven's dead. Can I take a message?" I trotted along the corridor, keeping an eye out for more insurrectionists, but the whole ship seemed eerily quiet and still. I soon found the reason for that. As I rounded a corner, I almost stumbled over the corpses of a couple of ladies' maids, evidently gunned down as they tried to flee, and any thoughts I might have had about offering terms of surrender to the pirates evaporated abruptly. Civilian casualties are a sad inevitability of warfare, but any true servant of the Emperor tries to avoid harming his subjects as much as possible. Casual butchery like this was the mark of creatures like the orcs or debased followers of the ruinous powers, and for the first time I began to appreciate just how ruthless my foes were in pursuit of their agenda. The unfortunate women were just the first of many, I discovered, as I made my way through the passageways. Servant and plenipotentiary alike had been slaughtered where they stood, or more frequently, as they ran, or tried to make a fight of it. The guest quarters, where most of the local aristocracy and adepts had been sleeping when the insurrectionists began their coup, was a charnel house. I approached my own stateroom with a rising sense of foreboding, fearing to find my aide among the casualties at any moment, but to my relief, both my own room and Jurgen's were empty, only the faint residue of his body odour remaining to confirm that he'd been there at all. Where he'd gone, I had no idea, but his lasgun was missing as well, which was a good sign. Like any guardsman, he'd as soon be parted from his right arm as his weapon, and I was certain he'd be prepared to use it. As reassured as it was possible to be under the circumstances, I picked up the bottle of Amasec from my quarters and slipped it into my greatcoat pocket after a quick restorative gulp. So fine an example of the distiller's art undoubtedly deserved better, but I didn't have time to savour it properly, and I was damned if I was going to leave it for a bunch of murdering brigands. Then, as ready as I was ever going to be, I set off for the Vox room. Having been aboard the Wavecrest for the best part of a month, I had a reasonable idea of the layout, which my innate sense of spatial awareness in enclosed environments had helped to sharpen. Ever since Kari had conducted me through the service passages of the Hand of Vengeance during the Orc attack of Perlia, I had cultivated the habit of making a quiet mental note of the hatchways giving access to these areas on every vessel I'd travelled aboard. So I had a rough idea of how they interconnected as well. On a troopship or military vessel, these would be guarded by security codes, which I generally found some way to get my hands on, but in the case of the Wavecrest, the opportunity hadn't arisen, so I supposed I'd be stuck in the main corridors. That was irksome, as I was sure Hanar's people would be searching them diligently by now, but for an old hiver like me, playing Hunt the Sumprat in a maze of passageways was second nature, so I was certain I'd still have the edge. It all seemed to go fine at first. I knew the Vox room was 3 decks up from the guest quarters near the bridge, so I headed for the nearest stairwell. There were lifts too, of course, but I'd got far too much sense to box myself in, waiting to be gunned down like a trackie.
A Valhallan fowl, proverbially too stupid and slow-moving to offer any challenge to a hunter.
I'd be keeping them covered if I was Hanar, and from what I'd seen, whoever she was far from stupid. As I approached the stairwell, I heard voices. It seemed I'd read my unseen enemy right, and she had enough manpower spare to cover the stairwells too. Drawing my chainsword again, I flattened myself against the side of the corridor and peered cautiously around the angle of the walls. Sure enough, there was a reception committee waiting for me. 2 more fellows in the livery of servants, another crewman, and a 4th individual whose presence came as a real surprise. I'd last seen him at a cotillion in the ballroom a couple of nights before, where he'd droned on about the economics of fish ranching and the extent of his family estates at tedious length, before asking what I now realised had been a few artfully ingenious questions about the Imperial Guard regiments embedded in our task force, which I declined to answer, of course, in favour of embroidering a few of my own past exploits, much to my retrospective relief. It seemed that the conspiracy included members of the deep-water aristocracy, as well as the lower orders, and from the easy manner in which the fellow was conversing with his social inferiors, the pernicious notion of egalitarianism held out by the Tau had evidently found converts even among those with the most to lose from its adoption. I observed the group of traitors for a few more moments, before concluding that any attempt to get past them to the stairs would be doomed to failure. They had room to scatter in the wide landing, and if I mistimed my attack, they could separate and pick me off. At least one of the group had a combead too, and I couldn't see the others clearly enough to be sure that he was the only one. If any of the heretics was able to vox a warning before I killed them all, the net would be closing around me faster than you could say the Emperor protects. I was on the verge of slinking away when it suddenly dawned on me that the fellow with the visible earpiece appeared to be engaged in an urgent conversation, although none of his companions seemed to be responding. Intrigued, I tried retuning the set in my ear again and was almost instantly rewarded with the sound of Hanar's voice. It seemed she learned fast and was switching frequencies in an attempt to keep me from listening in. "Hold your position," she said, sounding a little miffed that no one had reported killing me by now. "He can't get off that deck without using one of the stairways or elevators, and when he tries, we'll have him." "Can you get another team down here to help sweep the corridors?" the aristo asked, confirming my suspicion that more than one of the group was in the comnet. Roxwell says he's already set the fusion reactors to overload, so his group aren't needed in the engineering anymore. A sliver of ice seemed to enter my spinal cord as he spoke. It seemed that the traitors were preparing to cover their tracks by destroying the Wavecrest entirely, making the loss of the governor look like a tragic accident. I'd seen spacecraft reactors breach before, although in most cases the catastrophe had been triggered by a lance or torpedo volley. I knew that once they'd carried out their dastardly plan, there would be nothing left of the yacht beyond a cloud of superheated plasma, burning like a brief miniature sun, consuming everything within a couple of kilometers of the explosion point. To hell with the Vox room, I thought. It was time to start looking for an escape pod. I withdrew carefully round the corner and considered my options. The launch racks were all on the deck below, on the reasonable assumption that anyone on the upper levels would head for the shuttle hangars in an emergency, which meant I had to get past the pickets after all. Suppressing the impulse to join in the conversation this time, I listened to Hannah's reply with considerable interest. "No," she said to my immense relief. "Roxwell stays put. They're already welding the doors shut down there. Kane said he's on his way to retake the place, so he can waste his time trying to get in if he ever makes it that far. Even if he does, they'll be waiting." I digested this with some puzzlement, wondering how they intended getting out before the reactor blew if they were sealing the room, before the full extent of their fanaticism finally dawned on me. They weren't going to. This was a suicide mission, at least for some of them, and for all I knew, the entire cabal was intending to go down with the ship, which simply didn't make sense. They'd achieved their objective, so far as I could see. Why not stick around to enjoy it, and get a pat on the back from their alien masters? Well, as I've remarked on more than one occasion, heretics are all deranged by definition, although this was more the kind of thing I'd expect from chaos worshippers than the followers of the so-called greater good. I gave up trying to understand it in favor of staying alive, which has always been one of my favorite occupations. However you looked at it, things were grim. I was just on the verge of chancing the stairs anyway, and trusting to the Emperor to watch my back in the regrettable absence of Jurgen, when the initiative was abruptly wrested out of my hands. "There he is!" someone shouted, an instant before a lasbolt detonated against the wall, far enough from where I was standing to induce apoplexy in the average Imperial Guard small arms instructor. I spun round, already bringing up my las pistol, to see a trio of crewmen charging towards me with all the finesse of a rabble of Gretchen, brandishing handguns of their own as they came. I put a lasbolt through the one who'd shot at me, as he was marginally in front, and to my immense satisfaction he tripped the others as he fell. I was about to pick them off before they could rise again when a stubber round ricocheted from the wall behind me. I turned to find the party from the stairwell rounding the corner, the light of murder in their eyes, and brought my pistol up, while looking desperately around for some cover. There was none. By sheer bad luck, I was between cross passageways, nothing to my right or left but the burnished metal walls. There was nothing else for it but to trust in the Emperor and try to keep them rattled enough not to shoot straight. So I bellowed, "Wah!" with all the gusto of an orc and charged at them, chainsword swinging and depleting the power pack of my las pistol as rapidly as I could pull the trigger. Of course, I didn't have a hope of accuracy under the circumstances, even a skilled marksman finding it all but impossible to hit a moving target while running.
A skilled marksman. Kane most certainly was, despite his frequent protestations to the contrary.
But him on Earth must have been looking over my shoulder after all, because one of my wild lasbolts caught the renegade Aristo on the upper arm just as he pulled the trigger of another Tau-made plasma pistol, making the shot go wide and punching a molten hole in the wall of the corridor. I was still a few strides short of being able to bring the chainsword into play, though, and to my chagrin, the sight of it wasn't causing them to falter as I'd hoped. It's a formidable-looking weapon, and generally an untrained opponent doesn't have the nerve to face one without flinching, being able to picture it shearing through their own tender flesh all too vividly. Untrained they may have been, but they were fanatics, prepared to die for their cause, and they held their ground, bringing their weapons on aim, each one certain that if he fell, one of his friends would kill me an instant later. Not only that, the two survivors behind me would be climbing to their feet by now, preparing to shoot me in the back. As I've remarked before, even the slimmest chance is better than no chance at all. So I did the one thing I hoped they wouldn't expect, diving forwards into a roll, hoping to close the distance and take the legs out from under them with the humming blade before they could readjust their aim. No sooner had I hit the carpet than a blizzard of lasbolts scorched the air above me, the distinctive overlapping crackle of a lasgun on full auto echoing from the enclosing walls. As I rose to my feet to find my putative targets making a mess of the expensive floor coverings with their bodily fluids, I breathed a heartfelt sigh of relief, despite the assault on my nostrils, which the act of inhaling now entailed. "Well done, Jurgen," I said, timely as ever. Warned by the sudden shifting of his aim, I turned and dispatched one of the crewmen behind me, a steward I vaguely remembered handing me a drink at a couple of social gatherings, and who I now found it hard not to resent having tipped, while Jurgen took out the other with a single shot to the head. "You're welcome, sir," he said as phlegmatically as ever, and glanced at me. "What do we do now?" "Escape pod," I said. I'd been in enough of them to know that they all carried Vox sets as a matter of course, and with the wave crest about to blow up under our feet, I'd feel far happier warning Zyvan about the imminent Tau attack from the relative safety of open space than fighting our way through to the Vox room. "How did you manage to avoid getting killed with everyone else?" "I hid in the service passages," Jurgen said, leading the way to an open access hatch in the wall which I'd barely noticed before. "I reckon they wouldn't expect us to think of that." He looked at me a trifle quizzically. "I thought you'd be doing the same." "How did you get the access codes?" I asked, not bothering to waste any more time on being surprised. Jurgen's ability to scrounge the most unlikely things bordered on the preternatural, and if anyone had been able to get their hands on secure information like that, it would have been him. His expression grew even more puzzled. "Access codes?" he repeated blankly, and it belatedly dawned on me that the locking plate such hatches generally had was missing. Apparently it simply wouldn't occur to the kind of passenger the Wave Crest usually carried that the utility areas even existed, let alone that they might be entered. "Never mind," I said, drawing the hatchway closed behind us, and tried not to breathe too deeply in the confined space. "How did you find me?" Jurgen shrugged. "They've killed everyone else, so I just listened out for more shooting." It had evidently never crossed his mind that I wouldn't have survived, and I found the notion curiously touching. "We need to get to the savior pods," I said. "They're overloading the reactor to cover their tracks, and I don't know how long we've got before it blows." Most people would have found that little piece of information somewhat disturbing, to say the least, but Jurgen simply nodded as though I'd been commenting on the weather. "Better get a move on then, sir," he agreed. We double-timed it in what I hoped was the most likely direction to find a vertical shaft, and found one with gratifying speed. I was beginning to think that the Emperor was looking out for me after all, although I have to admit I was doing my best to make things easy for him. As I reluctantly stowed my weapons and Jurgen slung his lasgun across his back, I looked around apprehensively. I knew some of the crew had joined the heretics, which meant that they'd be unlikely to overlook the warren of service tunnels we now found ourselves in. "Have you seen anyone else in here?" I asked. "Not really," Jurgen said, to my immense relief. "There were a couple of traitors passing through a while back, but they didn't notice me. They seemed a bit busy." "Doing what?" I asked, and my aide shrugged. "Messing about with stuff," he said unhelpfully. "Like the cockboys do, but without the incense and the chanting." More Tau influence, I thought. They don't have any respect for the machine spirits, just bullying them into compliance instead of invoking their aid with the proper rituals, and their human dupes tend to behave in the same way. Why their mechanisms don't just stop working out of sheer pique is beyond me, but perhaps they have other methods of propitiating them.
A question the Adeptus Mechanicus would very much like to have answered. A few Magi have gone so far as to suggest that the machine spirits of the Tau Empire might even be subverted and turned against their masters if they could somehow be persuaded that the servants of the Imperium would accord them the veneration they deserve. But, so far, no practical method of attempting the experiment has been proposed.
"We'd better move quietly, then," I said, at least partially reassured that the notion of anyone crossing from the passenger areas to the service passages seemed to be unthinkable to the renegade crew members. I climbed down the ladder we'd found as quickly as I could, stepping from it into a low-ceilinged corridor lined with cabling. There was a body down here too, a junior engine seer, judging by her robes, so it seemed that not all the crew had been in on the mutiny. Jurgen joined me a few seconds later and glanced around, unslinging his lasgun. "Which way, sir?" he asked, certain, as always, that I'd have the answer. "Down there," I said, indicating a passageway I was certain would take us to the saviour pods and leading the way at a run. Despite my innate paranoia and almost a century of discovering that when things appear to be going well, it's just because you haven't noticed the real threat, I began to feel cautiously optimistic. Even if the saviour pods were guarded, the two of us would certainly be able to overcome any resistance, and I reached out to open the hatch leading to the corridor with a rising sense of confidence. Not enough to overcome my cautious streak, which was beginning to kick in again now the Nagila was wearing off, so I kept an ear out for any stray traitors who might still be wandering around. I was still listening to the comm-beat I'd confiscated too, switching frequencies at random, hoping to pick up more chatter, but it seemed Hanar had finally given up playing that game in favour of complete vox silence, something I hoped meant that they were too busy to worry about me anymore, although I was too much of a realist to believe it. We emerged into a wide gallery, with one of the armor-crest walls Hoy seemed to have been so fond of, and I was relieved to find no sign of anyone's presence. No one living, at any rate. The bodies of a young couple were sprawled across one of the padded seats lining the Hullwood side of the concourse, evidently interrupted in the middle of a romantic tryst. The luminators were dim here, to allow the full splendour of the stars to be appreciated, and their bluish radiance cast a chill pallor across the faces of the slaughtered lovers. Despite the urgency of our errand, I found myself hesitating for a moment, scanning the starscape anxiously for any specks of light which might be moving, betraying the presence of marauding Tau battleships already inbound, even though I knew the effort would be futile. If things had got that bad, Zyvan would have mobilized the fleet in any case, warned by the Auspex traces of the invaders emerging from the warp. Well, let them come and be damned, I thought. Once Jurgen and I had raised the alarm, they'd find themselves coasting blithely into a trap, and serve them right for the cowardly curs they were. So thinking, I led the way towards the launching racks at a rapid rate, my stride broken only by the occasional need to hurdle another cadaver, alert for any sign of a guard, but to my surprise and relief there didn't seem to be one. There was a small group of corpses near the furthest of the pods, which was hardly a surprise. It wasn't hard to picture them being gunned down as they attempted to reach safety by launching themselves into space. A couple of paces behind me, Jurgen sniffed loudly. "Something smells funny," he said, oblivious as usual to the irony. "Plasma discharge," I said, recognizing the mingled odours of charred meat and ozone I'd scented in Hoy's quarters, and a tingle of unease brushed through me. How many more of the heretics had those damned weapons? There was no more time to worry about that, though, because I'd reached the nearest saviour pod with a hearty prayer of thanks to the Emperor. As I glanced inside, however, disappointment kicked me in the gut. The interior was a mess, wrecked beyond all hope of use, the Vox and the launching mechanism melted into slag by a volley of plasma blasts. "This one's the same," Jurgen reported, with a cursory glance at the next in line. "And so's this." "Check them all," I said, convinced that it would be futile, but clinging to the faintest shred of hope, as I always did. There might still be something we could do, or salvage, and if the worst came to the worst, we'd just have to break into the engineerium, take out the heretics guarding it, and hope we could find some way of undoing whatever it was they'd done to turn the Wavecrest into a massive bomb. As we reached the last pod in the line, though, Jurgen turned to me with the slight nod he generally employed when he was pleased about something, but thought it beneath his dignity to display overmuch enthusiasm. "This one's all right," he said. "Good," I replied, hardly able to seem less cool than my aide, and stepped round the huddle of corpses impeding my progress. As I did so, I glanced down, and my palms prickled anew. This was definitely not right. They'd all been carrying weapons, the same mix of stubbers and las pistols I'd seen the heretics favour, so they couldn't have been innocent victims as I'd first assumed, but the manner of their deaths was unmistakably the work of one of their own. Well, whatever internecine feud had erupted between the traitors was no concern of mine, so I followed Jurgen into the pod. As I did so, my foot clanked against a couple of holdalls someone had left lying on the floor, and, fearing a booby trap, I stooped to investigate. To my surprise, it was stuffed full of the kind of expensive trinkets the Wavecrest was littered with. Small gold statues, gem-encrusted data slates, a devotional cogwheel from the Engineer's Chapel of the Omnissiah cast in platinum, that kind of thing. Between them, the two bags must have held a small fortune. "Strap in," I said, taking no further interest in the find now that I was sure it was harmless, but I might as well have saved my breath. No doubt remembering the uncomfortable manner in which we'd parted company from the hand of vengeance, Jurgen was already fastening his crash webbing, his lasgun neatly stowed at his feet. Unlike the saviour pod we'd inadvertently commandeered on that occasion, which had been commodious enough to take dozens of survivors, this one was cramped, intended for a mere handful, and the narrow seats certainly hadn't been designed with armed guardsmen in mind, let alone a commissar with a chainsword and pistol holster. I couldn't strap myself in without taking off my weapon belt, which I did reluctantly, but kept everything as close to hand as possible. Unfortunately, the padding on the chair was as extravagantly yielding as the mattress I'd discarded, and I sank into it so deeply my fingertips could barely reach my weapons. No matter, I thought, and raised my hand to punch the launching button, which the artificer had been thoughtful enough to incorporate into the armrest of every seat. Before I could activate it, however, a middle-aged woman in the robes of an administratum scribe appeared in the hatchway, lugging another bagful of loot. Her eyes widened as she took in our presents, and she dropped her burden to draw one of the Tau pistols from the recesses of her robe in a single fluid movement. I couldn't press the button with her standing there. If she was caught by the closing hatch, the pod wouldn't launch, and if she wasn't, and it did, she'd gun us both down before we could fight free of the crash webbing and reach our weapons. So I smiled instead, projecting an air of calm assurance in the hope of seizing the initiative. "You must be Hannah," I said, as though we'd simply run into each other at a social gathering. "I am," she agreed, trapped by convention into responding rather than shooting me straight away. "And you're Kane." Her expression flickered a little as she got her first full-strength whiff of Jurgen, and a trace of surprise appeared on her face. "Who's he?" "Gunner Jurgen, my aide," I said. "Quite a resourceful fellow." "Evidently." Her eyes took in each of us, emotionless and calculating. "Any more of you evade this sweep?" I shrugged. "Who knows?" I doubted it, but it wouldn't hurt to give us something else to worry about. "No matter." Hannah echoed the gesture. "Anyone else on the loose will go up with the ship and your precious Lord General." "Zyvan?" I began in surprise. "What does he—" Then the coin dropped. "Oh, I see. That's why you're staying on board. You still need to steer this tub." "Quite." The ghost of a smile tugged at the corner of her mouth and subsided again. "The Wavecrest's a gigantic torpedo aimed right at your flagship. When it's been vaporized and your task force is leaderless, the Tau will be able to liberate the whole cluster from Imperial oppression." "I'm sorry to disappoint you," I said, masking my horror at the idea with the ease of a lifetime's dissembling, "but Zyvan's death won't make a blind bit of difference. In the military, we have this thing called the chain of command. The senior surviving officer will simply take over where he left off. But he wouldn't have Zyvan's flair for leadership and the unflinching confidence of the men under his command that the Lord General enjoyed. There was no doubt about it. If this heinous plan succeeded, we'd all be in deep trouble." "We'll see," Hannah said, gesturing with the barrel of the alien weapon she held. "Now, if you'll both get out of those seats and out of the pod, I'll be on my way." "Stay where you are, Jurgen," I said, suddenly realizing why we were both still alive. "She daren't fire that thing in here in case she fracks up the equipment." "I'll risk it if I have to," Hannah said, a trace of uncertainty cracking her imperturbable mask. "I doubt that," I said, allowing a measure of scorn to enter my voice. "I wonder how your comrades would feel if they knew their leader is nothing more than a coward and a common thief." "I'm nothing of the kind," Hannah said, her voice so tightly controlled that I could hear the anger behind it scrabbling to get out. "I'm quite an exceptional thief, and if those idiots are so keen to lay down their lives for the greater good, fine, they're welcome to. I intend to be around afterwards to reap the benefits." She forced a mirthless laugh, which didn't suit her at all. "Why shouldn't I be well paid for my efforts? How much have you ever got from putting your life on the line all those times you've been boring the parasites about ever since you came aboard?" "I get the standard pay specified by the Munitorum for a commissar of my seniority and length of service," I replied, comfortably aware of how much we seemed to have in common after all, plus accommodation and rations when required. I smiled slowly, an idea beginning to form. It was risky, But if I didn't do something soon, she'd kill both of us anyway. I gestured with my hand up towards my head. And the hat and the sash, of course. No commissar worth the name would be seen dead without those. I let my hand come to rest against the crimson cloth around my waist. Hannah smiled vindictively, her mind made up at last. "Then this must be your lucky day," she said, her finger tightening on the trigger. I fired first. The plasma bolt from the weapon I'd picked up earlier, vaporizing the front of my sash and scorching the legs of my trousers, before taking the traitorous adept high on the right side of her chest, searing away her shoulder and upper arm. She staggered back, shrieking as her forearm and hand, still clutching the butt of the Tau pistol, thudded to the deck plates. "Jurgen, go!" I shouted, relieved to see that she'd cleared the hatch, but my faithful aide had already punched the button on the arm of his chair. I just had time for one last glimpse of Hannah lunging desperately for the pod again despite her appalling injuries before the hatch clanged shut and the engine ignited, throwing us clear of the wave crest with a surge of acceleration which almost made me feel grateful for the excessive padding of the seat. "What do we do now, sir?" Jurgen asked, once we'd got the Vox to work and reported the situation to Zyvan, who'd assured me that the matter would be dealt with. "Sit tight and enjoy the fireworks, I suppose," I said, as a small nova flared briefly among the starfield, the wave crest detonating far short of her intended target as the flagship's crew made the most of the chance for some unexpected target practice. It would take a few hours for the pod's machine spirit to guide us home, and I fished the bottle of Amasec out of my pocket speculatively. I don't suppose there are any glasses aboard this thing. A mug of recaf. If anyone had asked Jurgen, which they never did, he would have said the operation had been a great success. As usual, Commissar Kane had outwitted the heretics they were hunting with ease, leading the squad of guardsmen assigned to escort him straight to the heart of the Coven, while the bulk of the raiding force provided a diversion by attacking the heavily fortified stronghold of the renegades. After a short, intense firefight, most of the Cabal lay dead, the few panicked survivors too intent on fleeing for their lives through the corridors of their leader's mansion to put up any further resistance. "Went rather well, sir," he ventured, as the Commissar sheathed his chainsword while making the odd little twitch of the nose he so often did. As always, Kane had made sure he was in the thick of the action, and must be in dire need of a pick-me-up by now. Fortunately, Jurgen had noticed a kitchen during their initial assault through the servants' quarters and was sure he could find his way back there. As soon as the Commissar was engrossed in discussing how best to sweep the building for stray cultists with the sergeant in charge of the escort detail, he slipped quietly away in search of it. The layout of the rambling house was a little confusing, but he found the object of his quest easily enough by the simple expedient of following the trail of combat damage. The path back to their entry point was marked by lasbolt pocks on the walls, many of which had charred the hanging tapestries or scored the intricate marquetry surfaces of the occasional tables scattered about the place. Most of these had once held ceramics, few of which remained intact, particularly around the scorch marks on the carpet and the widespread cratering of walls and furniture where frag grenades had gone off. Before long, the opulent furnishings gave way to the starker, more utilitarian environs of the servants' quarters. Although Jurgen didn't expect to meet any of the staff, most of them had fled screaming as soon as the armed guardsmen appeared, the ones that hadn't being cut down in short order alongside the masters whose corruption they'd shared. Too seasoned a campaigner to take anything for granted, Jurgen remained alert, his lasgun held at the ready. The cultists who'd escaped retribution upstairs were almost certainly long gone, but it was always possible that a few had gone to ground, hoping to slip away quietly once the noise had stopped. So musing, he caught sight of his objective at last, the light gleaming from neatly shelved pots and pans visible through a half-open doorway. He was about to walk through it when he hesitated, listening intently. Someone inside was speaking, the voice rising and falling in the unmistakable cadences of a chant. "Hela, Hela, Shayla, Hela, Shayla, Hela, ho." Jurgen had no idea what it meant, but he didn't really need to. It sounded like warpcraft to him, which boded badly for the Emperor's loyal servants still in the building. It might even inconvenience the Commissar. Redoubtable warrior though he was. Better put a stop to it now, he supposed. Besides, he needed the kitchen. Too bad for the heretic currently occupying it. Readying his lasgun, Jurgen dashed through the door, his eyes flicking left and right in search of a target. He'd been right. Someone was practicing warpcraft. A tall, elegant man in expensive-looking robes and far too much jewellery was waving his arms about in time to the stream of gibberish gushing from his lips. His eyes seemed to flicker with balefire as he glanced up at the unexpected intrusion, and his mouth twisted into a grimace of distaste, as though Jurgen was something he'd just found on the sole of his shoe. The guardsman's finger tightened on the lasgun's trigger, but before he could squeeze it, the air between them ripped, sounding, he thought, like the galaxy's biggest fart. It smelled like it, too. Something consisting mainly of eyes, mouths, and teeth stepped through the rent in reality and lashed out at him with half a dozen whip-like tentacles. "Finish the scum!" the sorcerer said, disdain dripping from his words like protomatter from the flesh of the newly incarnate warp thing. "Works for me," Jurgen said, holding down the trigger of his lasgun. The demon spawn reeled back, keening its distress, as the hail of lasbolts chewed its midsection to pieces. It was far from the first such thing Jurgen had encountered in his years of fighting at the Commissar's side, and in his experience they were never as tough as they were made out to be. Apparently that was something the Emperor had gifted him with. Inquisitor Vale had tried to explain it a couple of times, but she used a lot of long words that made his head hurt, and he didn't really care anyway. The fact that it worked was enough for him. After a couple more bursts from the lasgun, the warp spawn suddenly vanished with a pop of imploding air, driven back to the eldritch realm from which the Psyker had torn it, just as Jurgen had known it would be. He turned, taking in the rest of the kitchen in a single rapid glance. The Psyker was still standing in front of the stove, an expression of stupefied astonishment on his face, muttering another string of arcane syllables. Livid green witchfire flared around his upraised fist, then flickered and died as Jurgen took a step towards him. "You can frack off and all," Jurgen said, and shot him, wiping the stunned expression off the man's face with a single lasbolt. He slung the weapon as he stepped over the sorcerer's spasming corpse, freeing his hands to pick up the kettle, which gurgled as he shook it. Already full. That was a bit of luck. The Commissar would definitely be needing a mug of recaf by now, and Jurgen meant to see that he got it.
That was a short one. Right now I'm eating dinner, so I will unmute once I'm done eating, and we can get back to it.
Old soldiers never die.
Editorial note. Of all the desperate situations faced by Kane, when he had no alternative but to do so, the defense of Lantonia in 938 M41 must surely be counted one of the strangest, partly due to the nature of the foe, and partly due to the circumstances under which he found himself caught up in the events there. Editing this portion of his memoirs has been an equally atypical undertaking, since, for much of the events he describes, he was accompanied by an unusually reliable eyewitness, whose account I have used to supplement his own observations. I have also, in the interests of presenting as rounded a picture as possible, reluctantly incorporated a little additional material from the memoirs of Janet Suller, which present as formidable a challenge to the patience of the listener as those I've been forced to use hitherto, and for which I feel obliged to apologize in advance. As ever, I have left Kane's original account of events as close to how I found it as possible, keeping my own interpolations to a minimum, except for those I felt necessary to elucidate an obscure reference or otherwise clarify potential ambiguity. Although, where Kane was concerned, ambiguity was often the most consistent thing about him. Amberley Vale, Aldo Xenos.
Chapter 1. Given the number of times what was supposed to be a straightforward deployment turned out to be anything but, dropping me and the unit I was accompanying smack into the middle of a desperate struggle to survive, the knowledge that we'd arrived in the Lentonia system long after the war there had been brought to a victorious conclusion was a welcome change of pace. It wouldn't have done to let my natural inclination to do handsprings and shout huzzah show visibly, however, as I was popularly supposed to be the kind of idiot who'd relish the chance to put himself in harm's way in the name of the Golden Throne, so I settled on a vaguely rueful air, as though disappointed at our good fortune. Not that I was exactly relishing the prospect of the next few weeks, which promised little beyond unrelieved tedium and finger food, but compared to the kind of excitement I was used to, I'd take boredom over bowel-clenching terror every time. Especially as I'd only just made it up the boarding ramp of the last ship out at embarkation, the swarm of Tyranids on our tail almost filling the horizon. "I'm sure there are still a few pockets of resistance to mop up," I said privately, resolving to discover where they were and make sure I avoided them. "Of course," Colonel Castine said, running a finger around the collar of her dress uniform in the manner of someone suppressing the desire to unfasten it. Like most ice welders, she preferred shirt sleeves for the most part, reserving the heavy greatcoats generally associated with Valhallan regiments for environments they were fitted to, and had chosen summer kit for the occasion, although the weather in the planetary capital seemed distinctly autumnal if you asked me. Dark grey clouds were scudding across a light grey sky mottled with flecks of blue, and the scent of recent rain had been the first thing to greet my nostrils as the boarding ramp of our shuttle extruded itself to lick the still damp rockcrete of the pad, as if tentatively quenching its thirst. In the distance, across the wide expanse of the landing field, columns of steam marked the points where the rest of our heavy shuttles had grounded. The commandeered freighter we'd arrived on didn't have nearly enough of its own to disembark an entire regiment, of course, but by this time the local traffic controllers had acquired sufficient experience of offloading large bodies of troops and their equipment to divert a veritable swarm of them to pick us up almost as soon as we'd reached orbit, and I'd made sure I was among the first wave to hit the ground. Something I always tried to do when the likelihood of meeting significant resistance was low, as it consolidated my undeserved reputation for leading from the front, and gave me a head start in finding the most comfortable quarters wherever we were due to be billeted. I imagine the regiments already here will be happy to catch their breath while we dot the I's and cross the T's. Who are they, anyway? Vostroyans, mostly, I said, glancing at the data slate my aide had just handed to me. Jurgen had tidied himself up too, insofar as that was possible, centering his helmet on his head.
The typically Valhallan fur caps, like the greatcoats Kane has already alluded to, generally being donned only in sub-zero temperatures.
And brushing most of the accumulated detritus from the ragged clumps of facial hair which more or less assembled themselves into a scurf-flecked beard. Despite these heroic efforts, he seemed to have stopped some way short of actual ablutions, however, and I found myself falling into my usual habit of edging upwind of him as I spoke. 3 line regiments and an armour group, plus the Talon 236th, who got here a couple of weeks ahead of the others after being diverted on their way back to Coronus for reassignment, and a Valhallan unit for fire support. I don't mind admitting my voice took on a tinge of surprise at this point. The 12th Field Artillery, the regiment I'd begun my long and inglorious career with some 20 years before. Haven't seen them since Gravilax, Castine said, although whether she was pleased at the prospect of renewing the acquaintance or not was hard to tell, since she was fighting off another attempt at strangulation by her shirt collar at the time. We've all come a long way since then, I said, and the Colonel nodded thoughtfully. Thanks to you, she replied. And if you hadn't joined us when you did, we wouldn't have lasted another week, never mind 7 years up at the sharp end.
When Kane joined what was to become the 597th in 931 M41, the 2 former regiments making it up were practically at one another's throats. Typically, his account of that period of his career glosses over the credit that he undoubtedly deserves for welding them into an effective fighting unit, concentrating instead on what he perceives as his self-interested motives for doing so.
Any other commissar would have done the same, I said, feeling unaccountably embarrassed for a moment, although I suppose many of my colleagues would have gone about the job in a rather more brutally straightforward manner. And probably ended up on the wrong end of a friendly fire accident too, which is what tends to happen when you incur the displeasure of a large number of people with guns. Castine looked as though she was about to take issue with that, but before she got the chance, Jurgen broke into the conversation with a phlegm-laden attempt at a tactful cough. "I think that's your escort, sir?" He sounded vaguely affronted at the notion, as if it somehow cast doubt on his own ability to ensure our safety, although, since the wretched planet was supposed to be pacified by this point, the matter was purely one of protocol in any case. "I think you're right," I agreed, as the small knot of vehicles drew closer. A ground car, too large, black and shiny to be military issue, was flanked by a couple of outriders on motorcycles, the pennons flying from poles affixed to the riders' backs, echoing the design of the smaller ones fluttering around the limousine. I didn't recognize the heraldry, but it seemed to involve a great deal of gold thread entangling an imperial aquila like vines clambering up a wall. Looked more like arbites than soldiers.
Like many seasoned warp travelers, Kane tended to use the term arbites colloquially to refer to local law enforcers, as well as actual members of the Adeptus Arbites, which, given the bewildering variety of nomenclature on different worlds, he can hardly be blamed for. Where actual members of the Adeptus are present, however, he is usually punctilious about the distinction. Since he doesn't mention any arbitrators in the course of his narrative, it seems safe to assume that the handful one would normally expect to find on a populous imperial world were either too busy to socialize or had been killed in the fighting.
"Governor's household troops, sir," Jurgen said, consulting the uniform guide and his data slate, something I suppose I should have done myself before now, but in all fairness, I was familiar enough with those of the other guard regiments among our task force, and the Lentonian militia were all either dead or confined to barracks, pending the purge of any who might have supported the wrong side in the recent insurrection. Anyone else in a uniform or carrying a gun would be fair game, or best avoided, depending on our relative numbers and firepower. "I thought they'd shot him," I said. "That was the old one," Castine said, a note of doubt entering her voice. "Usually we had Major Brocklaw to fill us in on these niggling little details, which he dutifully filleted from the brain-numbing morass of the Munitorum briefing materials, so the Colonel and I didn't have to wade through them ourselves. But Brocklaw was still in orbit, waiting for the last shuttle down to ensure our deployment went as smoothly as these things ever did.
And because the CO and second-in-command of an Imperial Guard regiment would never travel in the same shuttle, to ensure accident or enemy action would be unable to cripple it by their simultaneous loss.
"I heard they found a nephew or something to take over." "Good for them," I said, hoping he'd make a better fist of it than the last incumbent, who'd managed to rouse a placid and emperor-fearing population to armed rebellion with almost indecent haste following his appointment. Truth to tell, I was still somewhat vague about the exact nature of their grievances, but if the erstwhile governor ran true to form, it probably had something to do with treating the tithing revenues as his personal cash box and taking an excessive interest in other people's wives, husbands, or farm animals.
Wives and husbands, if the rumors are true, but not the livestock. Probably.
All in all, Lentonia was probably better off without him, but letting the plebs get away with taking decisions like that for themselves would only lead to worse trouble later on. So, as usual, the guard had been called in to restore order and visit retribution on whoever it seemed most expedient to blame. And of course, the local chaos cults had all crawled out of the woodwork to join in the fun, although, if anything, they'd probably helped in the long run, providing a handy foe the Lentonians could feel good about uniting against whatever their own differences. While we'd been mulling matters over, the car and its escort had pulled up at the foot of the boarding ramp, and the three of us walked down to meet it. The outriders saluted with simultaneous precision, the polarized visors of their helmets melding almost seamlessly with the glossy black body armor which encased them, and I found myself suppressing a sudden flare of unease as I returned the gesture with my best parade ground snap, It was like acknowledging a couple of chunks of animate shadow. The slighter of the two, whose build led me to suspect the presence of a woman inside the protective carapace, although without sight of the face behind the blank reflective plate it was hard to be sure, dismounted, revealing a holstered hell pistol at her waist, no doubt meant to supplement the carbine stowed just forward of the saddle, and whatever lethal surprises had been installed on the bike itself. She, for the sake of argument, took a step towards the car, reaching out a hand, but before she could open the passenger door for us, it popped from the inside, shoved hard by a young man with a shock of blonde hair and a wide, welcoming grin. "It's all right, Clarice, I got it," he said, sliding across the wide seat to make room for us. The anonymous trooper turned away, her body language making her affront at the breach of protocol perfectly plain in spite of her concealed visage, sentiments I was certain Jurgen shared. The young man stuck out a hand to shake. "Jonas Warden, Planetary Governor. Call me Jonah. I've had a lifetime's worth of Your Excellency gash in the last few weeks." Castine and I took in his worn groxhide jacket and utility cloth trousers and looked at one another dubiously. He didn't look like any of the Emperor's anointed I'd ever met. "Caiaphas Cain," I said, concealing my bewilderment with the ease of a lifetime of practice and taking the proffered hand, making sure not to exert the full strength of my augmetic fingers. "No nickname, I'm afraid, but in my profession you tend not to make friends." "Really?" The young man looked faintly surprised, then grinned, as if realizing I was pulling his leg. "There's a Valhallan officer calls you Kai. Sounds like a nickname to me." That would be Torin," I said, before glancing back at Castine, who was being helped onto the overstuffed bench seat by the same proffered hand. "You remember Major Divas?" No one else I could think of ever used the familiar form of my given name, which was just as well as I detested it, something Divas never quite managed to grasp in spite of innumerable hints over the years. "Of course," Castine said, while I settled into the seat opposite her and the young man and wondered which of the polished wooden cabinets mounted on the walls concealed the decanter. "A fine officer." She grinned at me, clearly enjoying my discomfiture. "You don't look much like a governor," I said, deciding to play the bluff man of action card. That usually went down well with civilians who thought they knew what sort of a man I was, and I intended to use the technique a lot in the next few weeks. I still wasn't exactly overjoyed about being dragged into a political junket, and was damned if I was going to be any more gracious about it than I had to be. "I don't feel like one either," Jonah said with disarming candour, and I found myself in some danger of liking him. "I used to glean news for the Light of Truth."
A well-regarded local print sheet.
"Till some dungwit dragged me off to the palace. Can't have been that much of a surprise," I said, "if you were next in line." Jonah laughed. "Nowhere near it. My mother turned her back on the whole festering lot of them 30 years ago. Wouldn't have been here if she hadn't." "I see," I said, although I didn't quite. "There's still some bad feeling among the rest of the family, I take it?" "Oh, there surely is now," he grinned. "Why do you think the Martial Law Council stuck me with the job?" "At a guess, because you're the only member of the family who didn't want it," I said, and he nodded. "They were fighting over the throne like rats in a sack. I did some good pieces on it." He started to pull out a battered data slate, then thought better of it, no doubt correctly divining that they wouldn't mean much to us anyway. Power broking, character assassination. A couple didn't start character either. Sold a lot of sheets. Then he sighed, the animation which had come over him slipping away again, and waved a disgusted-looking hand at our luxurious surroundings. "Now this, your council's got a poor sense of humour." But a strong grasp of the practical, I thought. In my experience, the only people it's safe to have in a position of power are the ones who don't want to be there in the first place. Before I could say anything to that effect, however, my aide's shadow filled the doorway, and his bouquet flowed out ahead of him to fill the car. Jonah recoiled. "Jurgen," I said diplomatically, "would you mind following us in the Salamander? I'm sure our host has enough to do without seeing us to our quarters when the meeting's over." "It's no trouble," the young man said in the reflexively polite way of someone who knows you know they don't mean it, still too stunned at Jurgen's appearance to take umbrage at my near use of the term he detested. As the door slammed, following Jurgen's "very good, sir," and something resembling a salute, he shook himself as though rousing from a stupor. "What was that?" "My aide," I said, feeling no further explanation to be warranted. "Shouldn't we be going?" "I suppose so," Jonah agreed. "Don't you want to wait for him to unload your transport?" "He'll catch up," Castine assured him, knowing Jurgen's robust attitude to anything with an engine and clearly wondering how best to avoid the journey home. "If you're sure." The governor touched a Vox control. "Back to the gas factory, Fossil." He must have caught the questioning look between Castine and myself, because he added the concilium for our benefit.
A colloquial contraction of Basilica Concilium, the meeting place of the Governor's Advisory Council and, de facto, seat of government.
The chauffeur, invisible behind a panel of one-way armor glass, rolled us smoothly into motion. Comfortable as the ride was, especially compared to being driven by Jurgen, and in spite of our host's attempts to while away the journey with polite conversation about my upcoming itinerary, I found it impossible to relax and enjoy our luxurious surroundings. Aside from the young man's manifest eccentricity, meeting Imperial Guard officers from the starport in person hardly being the kind of thing planetary governors usually did, I was uncomfortably aware that his previous profession made him a shrewd judge of people, and more likely than most to see through the facade I generally presented to the galaxy. In addition to which, I'd been in enough vehicles like this to be well aware of what a tempting target they made. There were still malcontents on the loose, by Jonah's own admission, and even if they had no idea of who was inside the big shiny car, it was clearly someone of wealth and influence. Protecting it with no more than a pair of outriders was tantamount to towing a sign saying "assassinate me," so far as I could see. In fact, I'd been the target of just such an attempt myself on Pereira Munda, although, to be fair, on that occasion, I'd been the unfortunate victim of a case of mistaken identity.
The real target being the local arbitrator, who'd sent his car for Kane as a courtesy.
Accordingly, I paid a fair amount of attention to our surroundings as we left the bleak expanse of the starport and began to make our way into the city proper. Like many predominantly urban worlds, the main conurbation was contiguous with the boundary of the landing field, the outer hab blocks protected from the consequences of a crash or explosion by a thick, high blast wall, through which we trundled in a short, squat tunnel. Not unnaturally, this made a formidable fortification, which the rebels had attempted to hold against the arriving Imperial forces, resulting in a fair amount of damage, particularly once my old comrades from the 12th Field Artillery unlimbered their earthshakers and got stuck in. Deep craters in the inner walls and a few crumbled ramparts clearly marked the positions where the main fortifications had been. Shells being shells, the hab blocks around the perimeter had taken quite a battering too, and on first re-emerging into daylight we found ourselves traversing a bleak hinterland of tumbled walls and scattered rubble, through which the hastily patched roadway slashed like a gutting knife. At first I thought it deserted, but before long occasional glimpses of a stretched tarp or the smoke from a cooking fire betrayed the presence of inhabitants, eking out what existence they could among the ruins. "Outliers," Jonah said, seeing the direction of my gaze. "Not much trouble, unless they get caught up in a food riot. Most of them just want to be left alone." "Most of them?" I asked, my paranoia going into overdrive, and the governor shrugged. "There's a few rock lobbers among them and gangers squabbling over territory, but they'll keep to the local militia reactivated." "Glad to hear it," I said, somewhat relieved, but still keeping my hands near my weapons. I was beginning to see movement between the shattered walls more and more frequently, and wondered if waiting for the rest of the regiment might not have been a better idea. "Why are we slowing?" Castine asked, unfastening the flap of her holster, and I hastened to follow her lead. We'd both spent most of our lives in war zones, and knew from bitter experience that even the most subtle intimations of trouble should never be ignored. Jonah looked bewildered, and about as nervous as most civilians do when their guests unexpectedly draw sidearms in a confined space. My chainsword I left scabbarded for the nonce, as it would be more of a danger to ourselves in our suddenly claustrophobic surroundings than to a putative attacker. "No idea," he said, and activated the Vox. "Fossil?" "The road's blocked," the chauffeur informed us, sounding irritated rather than concerned. "Some kind of crowd up ahead." "Armed?" I asked. "Nothing obvious," a feminine voice cut in. Clarice, I presumed. "They're just milling around, trading food, probably moving up to clear them." "Can we see from in here?" Castine asked, a moment before I could pose the question myself, and the governor poked a control stud. With a squeal of gears, the partition retracted, revealing our driver, dressed in the same body armor as the Outriders, but without a helmet. Beyond him, the road was now visible, blocked by 20 or 30 ragged-looking civilians. It was hard to make much out, as the shadows were plentiful and deep, but they were an unhealthy-looking bunch, their skins sallow, their movements slow and uncoordinated. All of a sudden, I found myself grateful for the armoured bodywork surrounding us, for I had no doubt that it would be proof against any weapons this curiously passive mob might bring to bear. Not a single one reacted as the motorcyclists bore down on their position, beyond slowly turning heads to track their movement. The Outriders drew to a halt a few meters away, their engines revving, and ordered them to disperse. Still no reaction, and I found my palms tingling. A warning from my subconscious I'd learned to take seriously over the years. "Pull back," I cautioned, hoping the Vox would relay my words, but if they did, it was too late. The whole crowd suddenly began to move, like a single viscid pool of degenerate humanity, surging forwards to engulf the riders before either could react. Both troopers tried to gun their engines and pull away, but hadn't room to turn their heavy bikes. As we watched, helpless and horrified, they were pulled from their mounts and overwhelmed by sheer force of numbers, disappearing into the depths of the mob as thoroughly as if they'd been absorbed by a tyrannid swarm. "What he said!" Jonah snapped, knowing trouble when he saw it, which was hardly surprising given his former occupation. Unfortunately, the chauffeur had kept us moving slowly forwards, confident in his comrade's ability to clear the way, and by the time he slammed the gears into reverse, with a grinding sound even Jurgen might have winced at, the tide of bodies was already lapping around our fragile refuge. The car bumped, running over several yielding obstacles before suddenly fetching up against an immovable one with a groan of stressed metal. Unable to see, our driver had mounted the pavement and rammed one of the larger pieces of rubble. "How solid is this thing?" I asked, flicking the safety off my las pistol while Castine chambered a round into her bolt pistol and began an urgent conversation about reinforcements over her Vox speed. Reinforcements we both knew were unlikely to arrive in time. "Solid enough," Jonah said, although I doubted that. The Colonel's bolt pistol could definitely punch a hole through the armor-glass window, although doing so from this side would undoubtedly deafen us, not to mention fill the passenger compartment with razor-edged shards. Our attackers didn't seem to be carrying any armor-piercing small arms, however, so getting in would take them a little more time than that. Or not. Blank-eyed, heedless of the damage they were doing to themselves, they kept battering relentlessly at the bodywork, clawing at the metal and armor glass in their single-minded determination to get in. The window nearest my head crazed where one of the rioters butted it repeatedly, flecks of blood and brain tissue marring the transparent surface. Most disturbing of all was the silence. Throughout their frenzied onslaught, not one of them spoke. Although, given their behaviour, that was hardly surprising. I'd seen things in Jurgen's hair that showed more signs of intelligence. Even the sounds of their movement were inaudible, muffled by the thick armour enclosing us. "They're insane," Castine said, more of a dispassionate tactical assessment than an expression of alarm, despite her vehemence. "Or on combat drugs," I agreed, although where they might have got them from was beyond me. I turned to the governor, who was looking pale and hyperventilating. A bad sign, as, offhand, I could hardly think of worse circumstances in which to be stuck in a confined space with a panicking civilian. "Any of the local gangers use Slort, Zerk, stuff like that?" "No, I don't think so." As I'd hoped, answering the simple, direct question brought him back a little, and it pressed my advantage. "You're a gleaner, right? Anything unusual you'd know?" He shook his head, though whether in negation or to clear it would be anybody's guess. "The last year or so there've been nothing but wild stories," he told me. "The insurrection, then the heretics. There were even supposed to be psychers among them, but nobody actually saw any." The whole car lurched, a development I didn't like the feel of in the least. "They're climbing onto the roof," Castine said, clearly wondering whether to try putting a bolt through it to discourage them, before deciding against the experiment, much to my relief. The top armour would be the weakest, to save weight, but it might still be strong enough to direct the full force of the explosive charge back towards us. The floor, on the other hand, had been heavily reinforced against mines, lowering the car's centre of gravity, and, thank the throne for that, they'd probably have had us over by now if it wasn't. Sure enough, the battering sound above us grew louder, and the ceiling began to develop some ominous dents. Isolated from us in his armor-glass box, the chauffeur produced a combat shotgun from under his seat and racked it with an enormous clack, clearly anticipating the end in a matter of moments. I was just on the point of commending my spirit to the Emperor and hoping he hadn't been paying too much attention to my activities of late when the world around us erupted in a flickering orange glare. Searing flames lapped around the immobilized car, our attackers crisping and withering, losing their grips on the bodywork along with their musculature. Naked bones appeared through the sizzling flesh, skulls leering at us for a moment before falling away. Then the firestorm ceased as abruptly as it had begun. "Are you all right, sir?" Jurgen asked, his familiar and welcome voice suddenly filling my vox bead as he brought the hurtling salamander to a shuddering halt amid a blizzard of shredded roadbed from beneath the locked tracks. He waved a cheerful greeting over the jagged lip of metal where a Carnifex had ripped the top of the driver's compartment clean away in its eagerness to get at him during our desperate flight to safety. Unsurprisingly, it seemed, the regimental engineers were still concentrating their efforts on getting the chimeras back into shape, my personal transport having to wait its turn in the name of operational efficiency. "Fine." I kicked the door open and piled out instantly, drawing my chainsaw as I went. There were still scattered pools of blazing promethium from the heavy flamer burst in our immediate vicinity, not to mention a fair number of combusting corpses. And if our fuel tank had been ruptured, the whole thing could go up at any moment. Nothing attacked me, although if any of our assailants still lived and were making a run for it, I couldn't tell, the thick pall of foul-smelling smoke from their fellows' immolation concealing most of our surroundings from view. Now that it seemed I'd escaped sharing their fate, I had an image to maintain, so I glanced back at Castine, Jonah, and the open-mouthed chauffeur with an appropriately heroic flourish of my weapons and beckoned to them. "All clear," I said, rather spoiling the gesture with a cough as I got a lungful of greasy smoke. "Lucky the armor held," Castine said, with a rather tight nod in Jurgen's direction. "Thought it would," my aide agreed phlegmatically, "but it wouldn't have if I'd used the heavy bolter to scrape 'em off." "I suppose not," I agreed, unable to fault his logic, and, scabbarding the chainsword again, I turned to the governor. "It seems it's my turn to offer you a lift." "I appreciate it," the young man assured me, scrambling into the rear passenger compartment of the Salamander while his chauffeur stood guard with the shotgun, glancing left and right in barely suppressed panic. "Best check out the riders," Castine said, leading the way towards the wreckage of the motorbikes. Conscious of our audience, I began to follow her, despite the almost overwhelming impulse to clamber aboard the scout vehicle and get as far away from this blighted wasteland as possible. As I approached the nearest body, Jurgen joined me, his lasgun held ready for use, and his distinctive odour fighting to be noticed over the stench from the crackling cadavers. "Merci," he commented, looking down, and I nodded. The larger of the two outriders had been partially protected from the fury of the mob by his body armour, but clearly not thoroughly enough. His head was lolling at an angle only possible with a broken neck, while several plates of his external carapace had been ripped clean away, exposing the flesh beneath, and the condition of that had already been accurately summarized by my aide. After some of the sights I've seen, it takes a lot to turn my stomach. But those raking, bone-exposing wounds did the trick all right, not at least because I had no doubt that I'd have suffered a similar fate if my aide hadn't intervened in so timely a fashion. "Are those bite marks?" I asked, incredulous, although the answer to that was obvious after even the most cursory inspection. The manner in which the flesh was torn all too distinctive. Jurgen nodded. "Looks like," he agreed, as incapable as ever of recognizing a rhetorical question. "This one's alive," Castine called, forestalling any further comment I might have made, and we hurried over to join her. Clarice had fared a little better, evidently having had time to draw her hell pistol and get off a shot or two before being borne to the ground, although she was unconscious and her visible wounds were hardly less severe than those of her deceased colleague. "Not for long," I said, while Jurgen produced a medipack from the collection of pouches and webbing he was habitually festooned with and began patching up the worst of the leaks. "Unless we get her to a Medicae." Castine nodded, her face set. "We will," she said grimly. "Then I'm sending in a couple of platoons to clear the ruins." She shook her head, still unwilling to believe the evidence of her own eyes. Cannibals in the heart of an imperial capital. It's intolerable. Desperation can drive people to almost anything, I said, although if the tingling in my palms was anything to go by, there was something a lot deeper and darker at the heart of Lentonia than that. Just how dark, though, I had still to discover.
Alright, so bad news. My .2mm nozzle clogged, and I don't have anything small enough to unclog it. Which really sucks, because I need that high detail flow. Maybe if I'll remove everything again and just put it in the oven for a little bit and hopefully melt all the plastic out of it. See if I can find any not high detail, but tiny needles that can fit into the .2 nozzle to unclog it. So until then, I'm gonna be eating dinner, and let's re-slice it.
Chapter 2. What with one thing and another, our official reception at the Concilium was rather late in starting. Like most local seats of government, the huge building was vulgarly over-ornamented on the outside, so the local plebeians would be left in no doubt of the exalted state of their rulers and betters, and even more so on the inside, to produce an appropriate sense of awe among those venturing within to petition the administratum functionaries who thronged the place or pay their tithes. The effect on Castine and I was rather the opposite, however, since we'd seen it all before, and tended to notice things like the way the gilt was tarnishing on the death masks of deceased local luminaries, Jonah's immediate predecessor being a notable absent.
Hey, old beggar. How are you doing tonight? Like I said, I'm in the middle of eating dinner, and I'm having to reslice this file because the printer messed up.
And the inordinate number of fraying threads in the fading tapestries of long-forgotten triumphs. If Jurgen had an opinion, he kept it to himself, merely parting the throng of babbling pick recorders and print scribes between us and the door with grim determination, the butt of his lasgun, and a bow wave of halitosis. Over 100 heads turned in our direction as we entered the wide, high reception room, which, to my complete lack of surprise, resembled nothing so much as a gambling den with pretensions to an air of sophistication. Spotting a refreshment table, I made my way towards it as best as I could through the scrum, most of the components of which seemed to want a word or a handshake, reminding myself that this was what I was here for, and clearing the way with my chainsword was probably a bad idea. I smiled and nodded like an automaton, pretending to remember names and faces, none of which made an impression strong enough to last a second beyond the breaking of eye contact. When I finally made it to the viands, I found I might as well not have bothered. It seemed Jonah hadn't been exaggerating about the extent of the food shortages he'd mentioned in the course of our journey here. If the top of the social heap were making do with such basic fare, Throne alone knew what the commoners were eating, apart from each other. All of a sudden, the evidence of cannibalism I'd stumbled across seemed a lot less surprising, although the thought of it still stirred my stomach. The meagre table had one compensation for the effort required to reach it, however. A streaming samovar stood at one end, exuding the welcome odour of tanner and a faint hiss of steam, no doubt intended to make the Valhallan contingent feel at home. Following my nose through the obstacle course of scarlet Vostroyan uniforms, admixed with flowing Talon robes and the rather more ornate garments favoured by local officials and nobles, I pitched up at the urn while the governor did his best to make himself heard over the babble of conversation. "Sorry we're late," he said, his voice shaking a little. He still looked a bit green around the gills to me, although whether this was the result of delayed shock or his first exposure to Jurgen's driving, I couldn't be sure. "We were attacked." He went on for some while after that, giving the impression that I'd leapt out of the car to face the mob and seen them off single-handed, while I turned my attention to the tanner. "Kai!" a familiar voice called. A hand fell on my arm, and I turned, selecting an appropriate expression of pleased surprise. "Toran!" Sure enough, it was Divus, a tanner bowl of his own in hand, grinning at me in the puppyish manner I remembered so well. "I was wondering if you'd be here." Rather to my own surprise, I found I wasn't having to work nearly as hard at looking pleased as I'd expected. The intervening years had evidently been kind to him. The streaks of grey around his temples hadn't spread very far, and the lines on his face were still faint enough to be barely noticeable. "I knew you'd be joining us eventually," he grinned, "once you got bored with charging off to chase heretics as usual," which was one of the reasons I tolerated his company. Despite being better placed than most to see past the facade I took such pains to present to the galaxy, he believed implicitly in my heroic public persona. Perhaps because he chafed at the lack of opportunity afforded him to engage the enemy directly in an artillery regiment, which generally potted at them from a safe distance of several kilometres, and being even tangentially associated with my exploit allowed him a little vicarious excitement.
The very reason Kane had had for contriving his assignment to them at the beginning of his career.
"Little enough, compared to what you and the other regiments have been through," I said. So far as I could see, the senior officers of all the Imperial Guard regiments on the planet were assembled in the room, along with their commissars, the high command of the local militia, and the usual random assortment of local notables. Most of them looked haggard and gaunt, on the brink of exhaustion, which was hardly surprising. The fighting had been concentrated around Viazalix, since whoever controlled the capital effectively controlled the world. And city fighting against an enemy who knows the terrain is a grim, attritional business. I had no doubt they'd be heartily glad to hand the mopping up over to the 597th and take the chance of a bit of downtime before moving on to their next war. Castine was conversing with Colonel Mostru, the CO of the 12th Field Artillery, who didn't seem to have changed a bit. Seeing me glance in their direction, he nodded a curt greeting before resuming what looked like an urgent discussion with her, no doubt filling her in on all the stuff that had been left out of our briefing slate. "We've taken a battering, all right," Divas admitted soberly. "A couple of the Vostroyan regiments are almost down to half strength, and the 12th is pretty stretched as well. Nothing like as bad as that yet, of course, but still." He shrugged. "Has the fighting really been that fierce?" I asked, trying to remember how much combat damage we'd passed coming in. A fair bit, of course, but all around obvious strategic targets and no sign of the widespread collateral devastation I'd have expected to see if the Guard had taken anything like that much of a battering. Divas shook his head. "Some kind of local lurgy," he said. "It hit the militia first, then started running through the Guard." He looked as though he was about to say more, but before he could, Jonah drew everyone's attention back to me with a wave of his hand. "Anyway, we got here," he concluded, his breath and colour restored by a large mug of recaf and a sticky-looking pastry, last traces of which he licked from his fingers before continuing. "Thanks to Commissar Kane," at which point every face in the room turned in my direction. "I'm afraid the governor exaggerates," I said, thereby consolidating the story nicely with my audience, with the possible exception of Mostru, who'd never quite taken my reputation at face value and had spent most of my time with his regiment trying to nudge me into harm's way to test it for himself. But at least I can hold my head up in this company now, having seen a little action on Lentonia. I was rewarded, as I'd hoped, with a ripple of polite laughter. "You're all to be commended for your efforts," I said, feeling that if I'd been brought here to give them a pat on the back and make everyone feel appreciated, I might as well make a start on the job as soon as possible. Not to mention reassure the population that Lentonia was once again safely within the fold of the Imperium, so anyone harbouring heretical sympathies had better think twice about it. I filled a bowl with Tanner and delivered it to Castine, thus bringing myself back into the governor's orbit along with that of most of the other Imperial Guard officers, who seemed even more keen to make her acquaintance than mine, which I could hardly blame them for, attractive women in the Imperial Guard being something of a rarity. "Torin was just telling me about this mystery bug," I said. "I take it that's the real reason the militia are still confined to barracks?" "It is," Jonah nodded. "If we deploy them to keep the peace before we're sure who is or isn't infected, it could get a foothold among the civilian population." "Bioweapon?" Castine asked, an instant before I could. A malady which seemed to strike down soldiers while leaving most of the civilians untouched seemed a suspicious coincidence to me too. The colonel of one of the Vostroyan regiments shook his head, his extravagant moustache bristling. "First thing we thought of, but deploying something like that's way beyond the insurgents' capabilities." "Unless it was one of the Chaos cults," I suggested. "Are any of them still active?" "Completely cleansed," the colonel of the Talon regiment assured me, before adding, "We would certainly have spotted the signs if they weren't." "I'm sure you would," I agreed. "Talons are among the most devout followers of the Emperor in the galaxy, and if anyone could be counted on to detect traces of heresy, it would have been them." "So an unfortunate coincidence," I said, although my innate paranoia was still having a hard time accepting that, and kept worrying away at the matter despite my best efforts to get it to sit down and shut up, which I'm bound to say failed. And, given how things were to work out in the end, that was probably no bad thing.
Alright, for y'all that have just joined me, uh, I've was 3D printing with a 0.2 millimeter nozzle, and it has clogged, and I do not have a needle or anything small enough to unclog it. So I have switched to a 0.4 millimeter nozzle, and hopefully it should print faster this time. The printer is a uh, P1S Bamboo. I know there's BS going around with Bamboo right now, but I don't really care enough to get into it. Um, Also, it's a makerspace. If people are upset with something, they're gonna figure out how to change it. That's all I gotta say about that. Um, yeah, I'm printing bases in clear resin right now, and testing out a train model for my girlfriend. So if things work out, in the FDM, I'm gonna release a model on my Colts 3D to sell. I don't remember the scale, but hey, like I said, if things work out, I'm gonna be able to sell it. And model trainers are like worse than Warhammer modelers, at least like in hobby price wise. I do like model trains though, but not not deep pocketed like some of the big major guys. Yeah, the bamboo thing is going to be not a big deal. I don't think it will be because literally look at what they did with Oculus whenever they Facebook bought them. People jailbroke that sucker like the next day. So yeah, it's gonna if they do if they make it like permanent and try to be an Apple, they're gonna jailbreak it and get out. The X1 Plus, yeah. I just have the P1S. I got one of the first ones. I think it's like model 32 because we did the pre-order. And when we got it, it had a few broken pieces, like, and we could never get the AMS working correctly. So I sold the AMS, and it turned out it was all jammed up and needed a very bad update, and had like some screws that were too far out and needed to be cleaned up. Due to how I print, like my cosplay pieces, I can't even use the AMS due to how big my spools are. Like I use the 3 to 5 kilogram spools. Also, I paint the stuff afterwards. So while we wait on that, let's get back to the Commissar Kane while I finish eating my dinner.
Old soldiers never die.
Editorial note. Of all the desperate situations faced by Kane, when he had no alternative but to do so, the defense of Lentonia in 938 M41 must surely be counted one of the strangest, partly due to the nature of the foe, and partly due to the circumstances under which he found himself caught up in the events there. Editing this portion of his memoirs has been an equally atypical undertaking, since, for much of the events he describes, he was accompanied by an unusually reliable eyewitness, whose account I have used to supplement his own observations. I have also, in the interests of presenting as rounded a picture as possible, reluctantly incorporated a little additional material from the memoirs of Janet Suller, which present as formidable a challenge to the patience of the listener as those I've been forced to use hitherto, and for which I feel obliged to apologize in advance. As ever, I have left Kane's original account of events as...
Chapter 1.
Oops, I'm going backwards.
Chapter 2. What with one thing and another, our official reception at the Concilium was rather late in starting. Like most local seats of government, the huge...
Editorial note. At this point, one of the elisions typical of Kane's account of events occurs, picking up the narrative again after a period of several days. The following extract may go some way towards remedying this deficiency. From The Liberation of Lentonia by Jonas Warden, uncompleted manuscript.
Despite his obvious reluctance to be separated from his regiment, Commissar Kane followed the path of duty, as I had no doubt he would once I'd got the measure of the man. I had harboured doubts before our first meeting, knowing how reputations can become exaggerated, but those had been laid to rest the moment I saw him bound from our immobilised car, resolutely determined to defend us from any further attacks without hesitation or thought for his own safety. Accordingly, though it clearly chafed him to be feted in public, and fritter away time he would have preferred to spend bringing the Emperor's justice to those determined to prolong the conflict, he devoted himself to the ceremonial duties we concocted as doggedly as he would have done those on the battlefield. The stratagem was undeniably successful, although the situation it was intended to divert attention from went from bad to worse. Despite the best efforts of both Medicae and Magos Biologis, no effective treatment for the virus which had struck down so many gallant warriors was found, the victims remaining either comatose or violently delirious depending on their level of sedation. Worse still, in spite of the rigorous quarantine to which all confirmed victims had been subjected, fresh cases kept occurring. A week after their arrival, only the Valhallan 597th remained free of the disease, and no one expected this happy state of affairs to remain for much longer.
Excuse me.
Chapter 3. Let's hope that's not a glimpse of our own future, Castine murmured to me with a jaundiced look at the row of coffins facing us in the chancel of the cathedral. I'd never been one for emperor bothering myself, but I'd been dragged into enough places of worship in the course of my duties to appreciate the ornate grandeur of this particular one. The soaring arches of the nave meeting high above us, obscured by shadows and the rising clouds of incense, while icons of the emperor and his blessed saints cluttered up every available surface. There were 12 of the polished wooden caskets in all, containing the mortal remains of an officer and a line trooper, randomly selected from the casualties of each of the 6 regiments which had put down the rebellion, to be commended to the Golden Throne with all possible ceremony in symbolic appreciation of the sacrifice of all the fallen. Throne alone knew what had happened to the rest, although I strongly suspected that they'd been interred with more regard for speed than for the niceties. "Any illness in the 597th yet?" I asked, fidgeting on the ironwood pew, which was getting hideously uncomfortable already, and readjusting the scabbard of my chainsword for about the 1000th time in a foredoomed effort to find a place where it wouldn't dig into the tenderest part of my thigh. The ecclesiarchy had been predictably sniffy about the number of sidearms the congregation had brought in with them, but as they were as much a part of the dress uniforms as the braid and the hat plumes, they just had to lump it. To my relief, the colonel shook her head. I'd spent the last couple of weeks ricocheting around Lentonia, shaking hands, inspecting troops, opening buildings, and, for a breathtakingly tedious couple of afternoons, posing for a portrait, which mainly seemed to involve waving a floor mop around. The artist had assured me that it would be miraculously transformed into an imperial standard by the time he'd finished slopping paint on the canvas, and I pretended to believe him. This was the first opportunity I'd had to talk to Castine in person and, since neither of us was particularly comfortable discussing sensitive matters over the Vox, assess how matters stood in the planetary capital. "No telling how long that's likely to last, though," she replied, clearly expecting the worst. "Did you clear the camps around the landing field?" I inquired, hoping to move the conversation on to less depressing matters, and Castine shrugged. "Swept the ruins, but it was hardly worth the effort. Whoever was living there had already packed up and left." "Or got eaten," I suggested, and Castine frowned. "There was enough blood and bone around," she agreed, not quite managing to hide her revulsion. "But they'll be brought to account." "No cornate shrines, I suppose?" I said, still unable to credit that imperial citizens could fall so far without a little nudge from the ruinous powers, and the colonel shook her head. "If there had been, we'd have burned the place out," she assured me, and I nodded. I'd have expected nothing less. At which point the choir struck up the processional, accompanied by appropriately solemn music, and I stood gratefully, while what seemed like half the senior ecclesiarchs on the planet filed in.
Not quite that many, though several were certainly present.
Enveloped in richly embroidered ceremonial robes. Behind them came the local notables, led by Jonah, although I failed to recognize him for the first few minutes, as he'd been smothered for the occasion in enough over-ornamented fabric to weigh down an ogrin. Spotting me at about the same time as the coin dropped, he favoured me with a rueful grin, clearly uncomfortable but determined to see his duty through. By this time, the most absurdly overdressed of the Emperor botherers had broken free of the pack, leaving the secular contingent to seat themselves in the front row of the pews, while the remaining ecclesiarchs ranged themselves about the chancel according to their status and degree of involvement in the ritual. Once everyone else had settled, the presiding cleric favoured us with a self-satisfied benediction and began to pontificate about the nobility of sacrifice, with all the pompous sincerity of someone for whom that meant being a little late for dinner, rather than dying an agonizing death on a far-distant world in the hope that it might somehow make an incremental difference in the fight to throw back the tide of darkness poised to roll over us all. "I now call upon Commissar Kane to say a few words." The prelate finished, having apparently exhausted his own supply at last, and I rose to my feet, conscious of the anticipatory murmur which rustled around the cavernous space. My feet echoed on the flagstones as I strolled forwards, trying to look both solemn and unhurried, feeling the pressure of 200 pairs of eyes on the back of my neck as I did so. Not just them, either. A small constellation of servo skulls was floating around the vaulting, carrying pictures intended to record my words for posterity.
And everyone else's. Contrary to Kane's usual opinion, not everything was about him.
Thank you, Hierophant. I hesitated a moment before continuing in response to Castine's silently mouthed prompt. Callister, we who defend the Imperium with our lives, our blood, and our very souls are fully aware of the destination to which the path of duty so often leads. I broke off again as a muffled scratching sound tickled my ear. It was barely perceptible, but it raised the hairs on the back of my neck even so. Over the years, I'd learned to distrust anything that sounded like stealthy movement, particularly if I was unable to get a line of sight on whatever might be causing it, and I had to consciously suppress the urge to reach for my weapons. I took a deep breath, hoping the unintended dramatic pause might be mistaken for a rhetorical flourish. Not that it mattered anyway. The picked recordings would be edited before being disseminated to the local population, so I'd end up looking like a silver-tongued orator whatever happened. So thinking, I launched myself back into my prepared speech, minor variations of which had served me well at far too many similarly depressing ceremonies over the years, only to falter yet again. This time, a loud thud echoed around the cathedral, and a ripple of puzzled expressions spread among the pews, turning rapidly to unease as the sound was repeated. Castine unfastened the flap of a holster, an example followed by many of the officers from the other regiments here to speed their comrades to the Golden Throne, and I found the urge to do likewise impossible to resist. "Commissar!" the pudgy prelate expostulated in horror as I loosened my chainsword in its scabbard. "This is a house of the Emperor!" "Then I'm sure he'd approve of us keeping it safe," I riposted, in no mood to debate the matter. The scrabbling sound had grown louder, to the point where I could no longer persuade myself that it was merely harmless vermin in the heating ducts. By now, the front few rows of the congregation were tilting their heads, plainly trying to
I was choking on water. I got water. Yeah.
pinpoint the source. The thudding had increased too, in both volume and intensity, multiple blows overlapping one another in a steady roll of drums like a panicky heartbeat. Whatever the cause, it was clearly time to be somewhere else, although I could hardly cut and run in front of so many witnesses. Then inspiration struck. "Regina!"
Castine's given name.
I called above the hubbub. "Get the governor to safety!" "Everyone out!" Castine called, picking up her cue perfectly and drawing her bolt pistol to emphasize the point. "Make for the doors in an orderly fashion." Which, of course, civilians being civilians might just as well have been mill around like panic-stricken sheep. Nevertheless, she and the other guard officers managed to start herding the local dignitaries towards the exit, which was fine by me. True, the press of bodies in the aisle was effectively blocking me from making a run for it myself, but I'd been in enough places like this to be certain that the clergy had their own entrances and exits. "The back way," I said, turning to Callister. "Now the governor's safe, I need to get you—" "What's going on?" Jonah asked, materializing at my elbow, shrugging his encumbering vestments to the floor with every sign of relief. Beneath them, he was wearing a shirt with frayed cuffs and a pair of artisan's trousers covered with pockets. "Are we in danger?" Before I could compose an adequate response to that which didn't include the phrase half-wit, cretin, or death wish, I was interrupted by the sound of splintering wood and whirled to face the serried coffins behind us. The noise was unquestionably coming from that direction, and for a moment I found myself wondering what kind of vermin or parasite could have found its way into the tightly sealed boxes to gorge itself on the cadavers within. But the reality was worse than anything I could have possibly imagined. With a further rending of wood, a guard-issue combat boot smashed its way into view through the end of the nearest casket. Seeing it, the choristers around us promptly panicked and fled, with surprising melodious shrieks of primal terror. "It's a miracle!" Callister genuflected towards the image of him on earth and took a faltering step towards the flailing limb. "We have to help them!" "That's not a miracle," I said, dragging him back by the arm. The Hierophant knew the way out of here, and I wasn't going to let him get himself killed before he showed me how to find it. Quite the reverse. "Warpcraft?" Jonah asked, sounding intrigued rather than frightened, and I shrugged, in as nonchalant a manner as I could, thumbing the selector of the chainsaw to maximum speed. Jurgen's presence would have answered that question quickly enough, but the mere thought of his image being pictcast to the world alongside mine at so solemn a ceremony had been enough to persuade me to leave him back at the garrison. A decision I rued heartily now, as his peculiar talent for nullifying any warp-spawned influences in his immediate vicinity had saved my skin on more than one occasion. "Probably," I said, hoping I'd be able to deal with the situation without my aid's help for once. I tried to sound as if I knew what I was talking about. "But this is consecrated ground, so it'll be weak if it is." At which point the prelate looked happier, even if nobody else did. I flinched as the crackling of breaking wood redoubled in volume and the abused coffin started to fall in on itself. The others were beginning to look distinctly fragile too. I began hustling the dignitaries away, as best I could with a weapon in each hand. "Now we need to get you out." He nodded and turned to go, common sense finally overriding his old professional instinct to poke his nose into things, just as the nearest corpse flung the battered remains of its coffin aside and rolled from the bier supporting it, landing on the cold stone floor with a slap like a pistol shot. It lay still for a moment, incongruously clad in a neatly creased dress uniform, then thrashed its arms and legs as if trying to work out how to stand. I put a lasbolt into its chest as it clambered upright, but it rose slowly to its feet anyway, apparently unperturbed. "Keep back," I cautioned, with every intention of heeding my own advice, and got my first good look at the thing we were facing. It was unquestionably the cadaver of one of the Vostroyan soldiery, the extravagant moustaches cultivated by the guardsmen from that world standing out even more fully than usual against the withered flesh and sunken skin of its decomposing face.
Vostroyan's guardsmen moustaches, so distinctive a fashion that they almost constitute part of their uniform. Indeed, it has been suggested, not entirely facetiously, that the size and degree of grooming are at least as reliable a signifier of status as the official insignia of rank.
Its eyes were blank, rolled so far up into the orbits that they showed little other than white, but the animate corpse seemed aware of our presence nonetheless. It raised a twisted hand, the nails of which seemed to have been elongated into talons by the decay of the fleshy fingertips behind them, and shambled forwards. I fired the las pistol again, with no more effect than the last time. "Stay dead, damn it!" I snarled, although whether that was terror manifesting as anger or desperate entreaty, I have no idea. Jonah seemed to take it for the former, however, aiming a tight smile in my direction, in spite of the fresh ambulatory carcasses bursting out of their wooden chrysalides on all sides of us. "Remind you of anything?" he asked sardonically, backing away as he spoke. Now that he came to mention it, it did. The way the animate cadavers moved, with grim fixity of purpose, their expressions blank, was uncannily reminiscent of the mob which had attacked us on the way in from the starport. The main difference was the sound, which I presumed the bodywork of the car had insulated us from before. This time I could hear it, a low, muffled groaning emanating from all of them, as though they'd just woken to the kind of hangover where even your eyelashes ache. For all I know, they had.
More likely it was simply air, or the gases of decomposition passing through the vocal cords.
At any rate, it got on my nerves, and I fired a third time, taking the nearest revenant in the throat. This time, the shot did have an effect, as it staggered, then began to move in short, random jerks, bumping into its fellows and the biers as it did so. Encouraged, I put a second lasbolt in the same spot, this time succeeding in severing the spinal column which the first had exposed through the ruin of the revenant's neck. It dropped like a puppet with severed strings, a disquieting thought because it rather begged the question of who was pulling them. "Will you stop fracking around and just run?" I demanded, as the whole shambling mob began to close in on us, which was easier said than done, as the aisle was still clogged with panicking local dignitaries. Among them I caught a glimpse of Castine, grimly fording her way towards us against the current, but unable to use her bolt pistol for fear of hitting an innocent bystander. "Avaunt!" Callister cried, having a sudden and inconvenient rush of courage or misplaced piety to the head. He'd taken the golden aquila from round his neck and was brandishing it in the general direction of the shuffling horrors bearing down on us. "In the name of the Emperor, be gone!" Then the closest of them made a sudden snatch, which would surely have seized his arm and dragged him into the reach of its charnel-reeking jaws if its grotesquely elongated nails hadn't snagged in the trailing sleeve of his chasuble. Exquisite embroidery tore as the talons ripped through it, and the Hierophant leapt backwards with a squeak of alarm, bringing down his Crozius on the crown of his assailant's head as he did so. The heavy gold icon of him on earth crushed the Revenant's skull, and it slumped to its knees, foul-smelling fluid seeping from its eyes and nose. "Well done, Your Grace," I called encouragingly, hoping that he'd finally come to his senses after a squeak that narrow, and he nodded, looking both surprised and pleased with himself. "Now move your arse!" I'd like to claim that my choice of phrase was a deliberate ploy, hoping to shock him into acquiescence by the sudden descent into profanity in these hallowed precincts, but if I'm honest, I was simply too annoyed to care. There were still too many witnesses around for me to simply cut and run, however much I might wish to, and the longer these idiots insisted on lingering, the longer I'd be in imminent danger. Fortunately, he listened this time and scuttled back in my direction, which, with Jonah now getting mired in the rush for the main door, left me in the uncomfortable position of being closest to the Revenants. Unwilling to turn my back on them, in case they rushed me as soon as they saw an opening,
Highly unlikely, as Revenants generally act purely on instinct.
I backed away slowly, keeping my chainsword raised in a guard position, which, though I had no idea of the fact at the time, looked as though I was covering the Hierophant's retreat, and did my fraudulent reputation no end of good. The one the prelate had poleaxed was on the floor now, still twitching, but in short, spasmodic movements, while the rest of the pack shuffled around it, spreading out slowly, like a patch of oil on the surface of a pond. Which was a worrying development. Already the ones on the edge of the group were approaching the limits of my peripheral vision, and I found myself worrying about being flanked as soon as I couldn't keep all of them in sight at once. I needn't have worried too much on that score, though, as the Revenants seemed to be wary of me, or perhaps of the weapons I carried. None had sufficient intellect left to seek cover, dropping below the level of the pews as I would have done, but they didn't seem discouraged either, just moving forwards at a steady walking pace towards the gradually diminishing knot of struggling dignitaries jammed in the doorway. I put a couple more lasbolts into the nearest, trying for headshots as these seemed the most effective, but succeeded only in blowing away part of its face and jaw before an inconvenient pillar hid it from view. "Caiaphas!" Castine shouted, breaking free of the scrum at last. "Look down!" I did as she bade and recoiled in horror. The Revenant that Hierophant had felled was crawling towards me, leaving a clotted trail of noisome fluid as it came, an outstretched hand on the point of seizing my ankle. I struck down with the chainsword, severing the limb at the elbow, but the animate cadaver didn't even slow down, continuing to advance as inexorably as a Necron. I hacked at it again and again, carving it into foul-smelling chunks, but it only stopped moving once I'd severed the spinal column. "Go for headshots!" I called to the colonel, alarmed to see that while I'd been occupied, the undead guardsmen had dispersed even more widely. Of the Hierophant, there was no sign at all, which was encouraging in a way, as I'd be able to take the credit for saving his neck, but disconcerting too, as I'd hoped to see where he went and follow him as quickly as possible. "No need," Castine said, a trifle smugly, and fired her bolt pistol at one of the Revenants closing in on Jonah. Its ribcage blew apart as the explosive bolt detonated, decorating the intricate wood carving on the end of the nearest pew with half-rotted entrails. I took a shot at the other, which hit, but proved as ineffectual as ever, the lasbolt simply gouging a chunk out of the obscene thing's right shoulder. Undeterred, it reached out for Jonah with its left. Warned by the slightly soggy explosion of Castine's bolt, Jonah looked up in alarm and ducked out of the way in the nick of time. Unfortunately, that left him between two pews, backing up as the motile cadaver plodded relentlessly after him. Even more unfortunately, one of the pillars supporting the ceiling was at the end of the gap, instead of an exit to the next aisle, a fact the young governor only became aware of when he backed into the immovable obstruction. The brief flurry of activity had given another knot of undead troopers enough time to shamble uncomfortably close to me, so I turned and hurried up the nave, having little inclination to try my blade against the three of them at once. It would only take a single misstep or mistimed blow for one of them to get under my guard, and once that happened, the weight of numbers would be certain to tell. The one on the left was wearing a Valhallan artilleryman's uniform, and I glanced at what was left of its face as I retreated with a faint sense of anticipatory dread. But of course it wasn't one I recognized. Few of the gunners I'd served with would still be attached to the 12th after all this time. Finding myself coming abreast of the Vostroyan Revenant chasing Jonah, I took an opportunistic swipe at its neck with my chain blade, decapitating the thing neatly. It collapsed where it stood, only a trickle of foul-smelling fluid seeping from the wound in marked contrast to the geyser of blood which usually accompanied the severing of a head. The governor stared at me wide-eyed, although he didn't seem to be hyperventilating this time, which was probably just as well considering the reek of the twice-killed corpse. "Are you all right?" I asked, because I was supposed to, and the servo skulls were still flitting about the place picting the scene. "Think so," Jonah said, holding a handkerchief to a slight scratch on his cheek. "Wouldn't have been in another minute." He stepped fastidiously over the body. "Thank you." His words were almost drowned out by a crackle of gunfire, which echoed around the cathedral. Now that their lines of fire were no longer blocked by panicking civilians, the rest of the Imperial Guard officers had begun picking off the remaining revenants, and not before time, if you asked me. "What just happened?" Castine asked, joining us, her eyes still flickering in every direction in search of a target. "I haven't a clue," I told her honestly, hustling Jonah ahead of us towards the welcoming arch of sunlight beyond the ornately carved door. "But we need to find out fast. Something was very wrong on Lentonia, and if past experience was anything to go by, it was going to get a whole lot worse."
Alright. Alright, so should I continue streaming? Really thinking about it, or should I play something? I haven't looked at Steam in a while anyway. What? Oh, I hit the wrong one. I haven't played Mad Max in forever. Yeah, 3-4 years now? I haven't played freaking Helldivers 2, but also my computer hates me when I try to play it.
Editorial note. Though not strictly necessary, I've decided to include another extract from Warden's account at this point. Kane provides enough information to make the events of the intervening period before he picks up his own narrative again perfectly clear, but since the additional material is available, it seemed sensible to use it. I have rather less confidence in the wisdom of inflicting the second extract on my readers, but it does at least elucidate the military position into which the 597th was unceremoniously pitched. And those without the patience to wade through it are perfectly at liberty to skip the entire passage. Positively encouraged to, in fact. From The Liberation of Lentonia by Jonas Warden. Uncompleted manuscript.
After the incident in the cathedral made the true nature of the crisis we were facing all too horrifically apparent, No effort was spared to trace the source of the outbreak and make sure it was properly contained. Having had the role of governor thrust unwillingly upon me, I was far out of my depth, but I was determined to do whatever was necessary to preserve Lantonia from any further harm. Though the job seemed incredibly daunting, I had the good advice of the Martial Law Council to rely on, not to mention the reassuring presence of Commissar Kane, who had faced and overcome many perils before. His experience, I was sure, would stand us in good stead in the dark days to come. Ultimately, however, the decisions were mine alone to make, and I was determined to face and fulfill my responsibilities.
Not entirely true, as the world was still technically under martial law, and he could have been overruled at any time. But the population were more likely to listen to edicts issued in the governor's name, and the Imperial Guard more than had its hands full. From Like a Phoenix on the Wing, the early campaigns and glorious victories of the Valhallan 597th by General Jennett Sulla, retired, 101 M42.
Ever the woman of action, Colonel Castine lost no time in apprising the senior officers of the regiment of the full implications of the grisly discovery made by her and Commissar Kane. Not a woman or man among us could have entirely suppressed a thrill of primal horror at the revelation that our true foes were not the misguided insurrectionists we'd been called here to force back to acceptance of the Emperor's light, but the very dead themselves, ripped untimely from their graves by the foulest of warp-spawned sorceries. With so many of our gallant comrades in arms fallen victim to the contagion which had swept through their ranks, it fell to us, the only regiment thus far unscathed, to bear the brunt of this new and terrifying threat. Thus it was that the daughters and sons of Valhalla took to the streets of Viasalix, determined to guard it, and the rule of the Golden Throne at all costs, including our own lives if necessary. A price which, ere long, it seemed we might all be called upon to pay.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna be ending the stream here, y'all. A little annoyed that the .2 mm nozzle clogged again. It keeps happening too. Maybe it's the flow rate and temperature I said that, but I don't know. I'll be trying to fix it. Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I'm like, I could play something, but I don't feel like it. Yeah, I'm just gonna end the stream here. See if anyone's available. See what happens. If something happens, I'll live stream again later. Thank y'all for joining. I'll see you next time.